Jason Corbett was born in Limerick, Ireland in 1976. From childhood, he showed the traits of a responsible, goal-oriented person. Jason's parents, representatives of the middle class, invested a lot of effort in his education. He attended a Catholic school, was interested in history and geography, and later enrolled at the Limerick Institute of Technology, where he studied industrial management. His career began at a packaging company, a company that specialized in the food industry. He eventually became its regional manager, responsible for logistics and personnel. Jason had a first wife, Margaret Fitzgerald. Together they lived for several years and had 2 children, Jack and Sarah. The marriage was solid until tragedy cut everything short. In 2006, Margaret died unexpectedly from a severe asthma attack. Jason had to single-handedly take care of a 1.5-year-old daughter and a 3-year-old son, combining fatherhood and work. Then, on the advice of relatives, he started looking for a house helper and a nanny. That's how Molly Martins came into his life, a 24-year-old American from Tennessee, with a teacher's education and a good-natured smile. She moved to Ireland to work for Jason. Initially, there was no romance between them, just work and shared childcare responsibilities. However, the shared routine, emotional support, and closeness in the household did their job. After a few months, their relationship became personal. In 2011, almost 5 years after Margaret's death, Jason and Molly married. That same year, he received a job offer at the American branch of a packaging company and, after some thought, accepted it. The family moved to the United States, where Jason took a position as plant manager. The house in Louisville was spacious, with a large lot, a fireplace, and 4 bedrooms, a typical picture of the American dream. At first glance, everything seemed to be working out perfectly. Jason worked, the kids went to school, Molly ran the household, worked part-time as a swim coach, and occasionally organized activities for kids in the neighborhood. But behind the facade of a perfect life, tension was building up. Jason, according to people who knew him, increasingly doubted that Molly was ready to be a real mother to his children. He wouldn't let her formally adopt them, and the conflicts over this became increasingly bitter. It was the evening of August 1, 2015. Summer was winding down. The family home was quiet. Jack was at a friend's party. Sarah was already in her pajamas. Around 9:30 in the evening, a car pulled up in the driveway. It was Tom and Sharon Martins, Molly's parents, visiting from Tennessee for the weekend. Jason met them in the yard. He helped unload the luggage, carried the bags into the house, said hello. All seemed normal. Then they all ordered pizza together and sat down at the table. Jack didn't get home until close to 11 o'clock at night. On August 2, around 3 a.m., 911 received a disturbing call. It was Tom Martins. His voice sounded choppy. He stuttered, clearly nervous. My daughter's husband, my son-in-law, got into a fight with my daughter, and I intervened, and I think he's in a terrible state. We need help. He's covered in blood. I may have killed him." The operator asked him to remain calm and explained how to perform CPR. While waiting for paramedics to arrive, Tom and Molly took turns massaging Jason's heart. The headlights of an emergency vehicle cut through the darkness of suburban Louisville, North Carolina. It was exactly 3:10 a.m. when the first patrol car and ambulance arrived on a call that had come in 10 minutes earlier. Davidson County officers stepped out of the vehicle and noticed it immediately. Something about the silence was unnatural. The door of the house was ajar, and a dim light was burning inside. The first to enter was the officer on duty with a television camera on his breastplate. 2 others followed behind, one carrying a suitcase with a forensic kit. Behind them was a medical team. They didn't know what to expect, but they were prepared for the worst. As it soon turned out, the worst had already happened. When the officers entered the house through the hallway and entered the master bedroom, they were greeted by a scene that was difficult to immediately comprehend. On the floor, face up, unclothed, lay a man. Beside him was a mess, an overturned night table, in the corner a lamp knocked off its base. Along the wall, just below the windows, a dark trail of dry blood stretched across the parquet. On the walls, drops, splashes, stains. especially dents in the area where the headboard of the bed was. The linens were crumpled and partially pulled off. Blood was also on the pillows. On the floor near the body was a garden brick, a rectangular piece of cement material with corners worn away by blows. Its surface was covered with brown stains. On the other side of the room, by the dresser, leaning on the knob, was a Louisville Slugger baseball bat, a wooden one about 70 centimeters long. It also had stains on it that looked like blood, and near the end, hair stuck to the wood. Medics immediately approached the body. One of them, after examining the torso, noted that the skin was cold and that there were injuries incompatible with life in the area of the head. While attempting a standard airway check, his fingers fell into the skull. At this point, he realized there was no chance. Jason Corbett was already dead. Police officers began the standardized procedure of securing evidence and the condition of the crime scene. The room was sealed off and access to the bedroom was restricted. Only investigators, forensics, and the medical examiner could be inside. Officers documented the bedroom environment in detail. Jason's body was at the edge of the bed, lying on his back with his arms spread and his legs bent at the knees. He was unclothed, and there were visible signs of trauma on his body. There were items of investigative interest in the room: a baseball bat, a garden brick, a broken lamp, and scattered bedding. Traces of blood, including fingerprints, were recorded on the walls and floor. The furnishings in the room also showed signs of a struggle. The nightlight had been turned over, the cushions crumpled, and the carpet moved from its usual position. All of this was carefully photographed and entered into the record. There was also an abrasion on the left wall of the dresser, presumably from a blow. Near the door there were traces of bare feet in blood, which later became part of the analysis of the movements of the participants in the events. The bathroom connected to the master bedroom was partially open. On the tiled floor was a towel partially soaked in blood. There were watermarks in the sink, as if someone had tried to wash the blood away. These details were recorded as possible signs of an attempt to cover their tracks. In another part of the house, in the living room, were Molly Martins and her father, Tom. Both were wearing clothes, but showing signs of distress. Tom was sitting in a chair, head down, hands clasped together. His burgundy-colored shirt was stained with blood, especially on the front. The watch on his wrist was also stained, and there were clots on his fingernails. Molly was in a state of shocked excitement. She paled at times, then began to rub the collar of her pajamas. The paramedic examined her, noting redness around her neck but no other injuries. Tom, on external examination, had no visible injuries despite the fact that, in his words, he had put up a struggle. The officers, after reviewing the parties' statements at the scene, decided to take both men to the station for questioning. They were not formally arrested at this stage, but were advised that they were to undergo a full interview on the record. They were credited with standard legal rights and gave a preliminary agreement to cooperate. The medical examiner's work in the bedroom lasted about half an hour. At 3:45 a.m., a preliminary report was made of the examination of the body. In the preliminary medical report, the specialists noted that Jason's body had pronounced marks of strong physical impact in the head area. The occipital part of the skull was particularly badly damaged, suggesting repeated use of force. The general condition of the body at the time the ambulance arrived indicated that he had been unconscious and without signs of life for at least half an hour. These observations were the starting point for the subsequent forensic analysis, which was to yield more precise conclusions. A paramedic who was present during the examination later said, "When I lifted his head, my fingers went into the bone. We've seen all sorts of things, but almost never like this." Despite the seriousness of what happened, the conclusion was preliminary. A full picture of the injuries and cause of death was to be determined only after a forensic examination and autopsy scheduled for the morning of August 3. The police began a search of the rest of the premises. The children's rooms were silent. Jack and Sarah were asleep. They were awakened later, and according to procedure, a child protective services worker took care of them. A social worker was temporarily placed with the children. A pizza box, Plastic cups and 2 bottles of beer were found in the kitchen, all evidence of a quiet evening meal. In the trash can were blood-stained napkins and paper towels. These items were also seized as evidence. Around 5 a.m., the entire area of the house was cordoned off. Floodlights were set up in the driveway and tents were set up for technicians. Investigators began reconstructing the course of events that night, analyzing surveillance footage from neighbors' cameras, checking home and cell phone call detail, gathering eyewitness accounts, including those of nearby residents, and correlating them with Tom and Molly's first statements, as well as physical evidence found at the scene. The investigators were particularly impressed by the stark incongruity between the external well-being of the house and the brutality of the incident. The rooms were well kept, the interior standard for a wealthy American family. Toys, books, the children's school books. In Molly's bedroom, neatly folded clothes, makeup on the dressing table. And yet, the horrifying epicenter of violence, just a few feet away. The whole house seemed frozen in the moment. Children's drawings on the refrigerator, dishes drying in the kitchen, a fan running in the living room, and death and blood in the bedroom. It was this contrast that heightened the sense of the irreversible. The police immediately realized that the case was not a simple one, and the investigation would go far beyond the local level. The next morning, after the house on the quiet street was cordoned off and Jason's body taken to the morgue, the investigation entered its next phase. It needed to figure out exactly what happened that night in the bedroom where his life ended. Police officers from the Davidson County Sheriff's Department began with the most obvious, interviewing Tom and Molly Martins. Both, tired and agitated, gave their first extended explanations in the investigator's office. According to them, it all started when Sarah, Jason's 8-year-old daughter, woke up in the middle of the night from a nightmare. The girl, terrified, came to Molly's bedroom and, she claimed, began saying there were insects and lizards running around on the sheets. Molly tried to calm her down, but at that point, Jason woke up. Next, according to Molly, events took an abrupt and frightening turn. She claimed that Jason allegedly jumped out of bed, angry at being awakened and unable to contain himself, began insulting her. Then, she said, he came over and began choking her, pressing his palm against her neck and then squeezed her throat with his hand, cutting off her breathing. At that moment, Molly screamed. The scream woke her father, Tom Martins, who was sleeping with his wife in a room 1 floor below. According to Tom's version of events, he jumped out of bed, grabbed the first thing he could find, a children's baseball bat he had brought as a gift for his grandson, and went upstairs. When he burst into his daughter's bedroom, he said he saw Jason standing with his arm around Molly's neck. Tom claimed he ordered him several times to let his daughter go, but in response, he allegedly heard, "I'm going to kill her." That's when he hit Jason in the head with a bat. This, he said, had little effect. Jason stayed on his feet and continued to hold Molly down. At one point, the fight moved to the bathroom, but Tom stood in the doorway to stop the door from closing and threw another punch. Then, they said, Molly lashed out, grabbed a garden brick she had on her bedside table, and hit Jason with it as well. What followed she recalled vaguely. As she admitted, the events began to merge into one continuous stream. Screams, blows, chaos. At first glance, the story seemed plausible. But the deeper the investigation delved into the details, the more contradictions emerged. A key role was played by an autopsy conducted by forensic scientist Dr. Craig Nelson. The autopsy results called into question not only the sequence of actions described by Tom and Molly, but also the very idea of the fight as they portrayed it. At least 10 separate areas of damage were found on Jason's head, with at least 2 of them indicating multiple blows to the same spot. The injuries were particularly severe in the back of the head, which the expert believed could mean that the blows were delivered at a time when Jason was unable to defend himself. Either he was already unconscious, asleep, or disoriented by the first blow. Nelson drew attention to one particularly important detail. In some parts of the skull, the bone tissue was so shattered that its structure resembled laminated glass. According to him, such injuries are characteristic not for a chaotic fight, but for purposeful, targeted, and repeated blows on the same place, and in most cases are found in severe accidents or falls from a great height. The fact that the body showed no signs of active self-defense was also particularly noteworthy. Jason had no scratches, grab marks, or bruises on his forearms or hands that would indicate that he was closing in from blows. This led the experts to believe that either he had not resisted at all or had not had the opportunity to resist, having been unconscious from the first seconds of the conflict. One of the key biological indicators was the absence of a hormonal response in the blood, which is usually triggered by a sudden threat to life, such as a sudden release of adrenaline. It was not detected in Jason's body, which also supported the theory that he was not aware of what was happening at the time of the attack. Equally surprising were the results of the toxicology report. Trazodone, a drug used as a sleeping pill, was found in Jason's blood. He himself had not taken it as prescribed. Medical records showed that the prescription for the drug had not been written to him, but to Molly Martins just 3 days before the tragedy. She had received a prescription for the drug from the family clinic, indicating that she suffered from insomnia. However, for some inexplicable reason, it was trazodone that ended up in Jason's bloodstream and in a dosage sufficient to cause drowsiness or even deep sleep in an adult male. Investigators recorded this as a red flag. How did a drug prescribed to Molly get into the system of her husband, who had never made such a complaint? When investigators returned to the scene of the incident and began analyzing possible sources of the drug, no open packages or residual traces were found in the bedroom. Nevertheless, the very fact of its presence in Jason's system became key to the new version of events, according to which the attack occurred not during the conflict, but in his sleep, or while he was under the influence of the drug. Also of particular interest was the garden brick from which, according to Molly's account, she allegedly tried to defend herself. It was on her bedside table, a place highly unusual for a building material. Investigators asked a direct question: what was this object doing in the bedroom? Molly claimed that she and the children were going to paint it, and since it had rained the day before, the brick was brought into the house and temporarily placed on the bedside table. On examination, however, no painting supplies were found in the room. No paints, no brushes, not even newspapers, which are usually placed under the surface. The explanation seemed dubious, especially since the brick itself had traces of hair fragments and splatters, similar to those on a baseball bat. With each new detail, the investigation moved away from the self-defense theory. Molly and Tom's behavior after the incident, the delay between the incident and the 911 call, the nature of the injuries, the lack of defensive wounds on Jason's body, the presence of sleeping pills, and the dubious explanation for the appearance of the brick, all combined to suggest that the original version of events may have been made up. Investigators were in no hurry to make an arrest. They collected facts, conducted examinations, took additional samples, consulted with forensic experts and criminalists. But even at this stage, the evidence began to add up. Jason Corbett was most likely not the attacker, but the victim of an elaborate and swift attack, which was later tried to be presented as self-defense. When the morning of August 2 turned to afternoon and Jason Corbett's body was turned over to the morgue, no one rushed to make accusations. Everything looked like a family tragedy, an overflow of emotions, a case of the ordinary suddenly turning into the irreparable. But the investigation had already sensed that there was something deeper hidden in this story than superficial explanations. Weeks passed. During this time, dozens of pages of materials were collected, results of expert examinations, protocols of interrogations, medical reports, photographic records. All this mass of information didn't just paint a picture of the night, it asked questions that Tom and Molly couldn't answer without getting tangled up in their own versions. The point of no return was passed when the results of the pathology analysis began to arrive at the investigating department. The forensic team came to a conclusion that called into question the essence of the story being told. The nature of the injuries on Jason's head did not fit the fight scenario. The injuries were focused, deep, and pinpointed. No erratic strikes, no defensive dynamics, all indicating that the blows were delivered when the man was no longer resisting. At the same time, forensics finished analyzing Tom and Molly's clothing from the night of the accident. The blood on their clothes was not the result of accidental contact, but of direct proximity to the point of impact. It was blood caught at the moment of the blow itself, from the direction and shape of the spatter no other than the result of participation in the active phase of the But the strangest element that solidified suspicions was the physical condition of the suspects themselves. When they were examined in the first hours after the ambulance was called, neither Tom's nor Molly's bodies showed injuries typical of those involved in a fight. Molly had only slight redness on her neck, with no subcutaneous hemorrhages, scratches, swelling, or pressure marks consistent with strangulation, as she claimed. Tom, on the other hand, was found to have no bruises, scratches, or even signs that he had been in contact with a physically active opponent at all. The glasses he wore were still intact. The wristwatch was only stained with blood. The hands themselves, especially the finger joints, bore no signs of intense exertion. This was abnormal for a man who, he said, had fought a man larger than himself holding his daughter in a grapple. When this information was formalized into a report, the Davidson County prosecutor had no more doubts. The evidentiary basis allowed for more than just calling the suspects in for questioning. It required their arrest. On January 9, 2016, just over 5 months after the night in Louisville, arrest warrants were signed for Tom and Molly Martins. Neither party knew about it in advance. The investigation proceeded without leaks, quietly and methodically. Tom was arrested at his home in Knoxville, Tennessee. It happened around 9 in the morning. He answered the door to the officers himself, didn't ask a single question. He just said, "I understand." He was taken away, accompanied by 2 agents without handcuffs, at the officer's discretion as someone who had previously worked in federal service structures. Molly was arrested hours later. She was found at her mother's house in another part of town. She looked emaciated, didn't resist, didn't ask questions, didn't ask for a phone call. There was almost no color on her lips, just one short, "Where are the children?" After being taken to the Davidson County Police Department, they were charged with aggravated causing death. They were explained their rights and conditions of confinement. There were no other detainees in the room where they were being held. Everything had been prepared to isolate them and protect them from reporters, who by this time were beginning to crowd the gates of the building. The prosecutor's office was ready for media attention. The case had international potential from the start. The victim was an Irish citizen, his children were in temporary foster care, and the defendants were middle-class U.S. citizens with backgrounds in law enforcement. There was no room for error. The very next day, both were handed over to the court for the initial procedural procedure. They were assigned attorneys and served with subpoenas for a preliminary hearing. The question of bail was considered quickly. The judge, having familiarized himself with the case materials, refused. The decision was motivated not only by the gravity of the charges, but also by the risk of pressure on witnesses, including children. When photos of Tom and Molly, taken immediately after their arrest, appeared in the news, many people saw not monsters, but haggard, aged people. Their faces expressed neither fear, remorse, nor anger, rather a realization, perhaps not of guilt yet, but of the fact that things would be different from now on. The investigators who had been collecting evidence for months felt not so much satisfaction as tension. They realized that now the hardest part began, proving in court that what they saw in the papers and photos was true. But they had confidence, because everything that lay before them, from the physical traces to the behavior of the accused to the medical reports to the details that couldn't be faked, all pointed in the same direction. In a first-floor bedroom in a house on the outskirts of Louisville, there was no fight for life. There was a massacre, and everything else was just an attempt to convince the world that it couldn't have been otherwise. Jason Corbett's murder trial began in the summer of 2017 at the Davidson County Courthouse in Davidson County, North Carolina. The defendants were Molly Martins Corbett and her father, Thomas Michael Martins. More than a year has passed since their arrest. During that time, over 300 pages of material had been prepared. Dozens of witnesses had been called to testify, and the list of evidence included everything from forensic results to an analysis of the defendant's behavior after the tragedy. The prosecution's case was based on the fact that Jason Corbett was killed in his own home while asleep or unconscious. According to the prosecution's position, the attack had nothing to do with self-defense. There were no signs of resistance from Jason. The head injuries were concentrated, indicating multiple blows to the same spot. And blood tests showed that he was under the influence of a strong sedative drug that may have been administered to him without his knowledge. Key to the prosecution's case was the theory that the motive was a conflict over the children. Jason refused to let Molly adopt them. According to the prosecution, it was the desire to maintain control over the children, the fear of losing them, and the accumulated tension that caused the premeditated and brutal attack. The defense in turn continued to insist on the version of self-defense. According to the lawyers, on the night of the tragedy, Jason woke up irritable, began arguing with Molly, and then allegedly turned to physical violence. Tom, according to the defense, acted solely because of the threat to his daughter's life. Defense lawyers tried to portray Jason as unstable, pointing to episodes of anger in the past, but there was no record of any confirmed contact with the police. The court heard testimony from more than 20 witnesses, including neighbors, paramedics, forensic scientists, and experts. Interview notes and contradictions in Molly's and Tom's testimony also played a part. Particular attention was drawn to the fact that they had no injuries, which cast doubt on the plausibility of the violent fight scene. Molly refused to testify in person, while Tom gave detailed testimony, but there were also time gaps and inconsistencies with expert testimony. After a 3-week hearing, the court retired to the deliberation room. The jury took about 9 hours to reach a unanimous verdict. On August 17, 2017, the Circuit Court of Davidson County found Molly Martins Corbett and Thomas Michael Martins guilty of second-degree murder of Jason Corbett. On the same day, August 17, 2017, Molly Martins Corbett was sentenced to 25 years in prison, and Thomas Michael Martins to 25 years in prison, both to be served in the North Carolina State Correctional System. Michael Eugene Williams was born on October 16, 1969 in Breckenridge, Florida, to Jerry and Cheryl Williams. His parents were people of traditional views. His father worked as a construction worker. His mother worked in school administration. They instilled in their son honesty, hard work, and religious values. From childhood, Mike showed himself as a responsible and purposeful child. He early learned independence, helping his parents around the house, and spent his free time outdoors. Like many boys in his town, he was fond of hunting and fishing. His father often took him with him to water bodies and taught him the wisdom of hunting. In school, Mike was one of the best students. He was characterized by diligence, perseverance, and friendly character, for which he was loved by teachers and peers. He actively participated in school life, played on the soccer team, and despite his natural modesty, was popular among the girls. After graduating from high school, Mike entered Florida State University, choosing the direction of real estate management. Studying was easy for him, and after classes he worked part-time in a real estate agency, gaining experience. Being a driven young man, he quickly realized that he wanted to build a successful career in this field. At university, Mike met Denise Morell, and their romance developed rapidly. She was a beautiful, well-groomed girl from a well-to-do family. Unlike Mike, who grew up in modest conditions, Denise is accustomed to comfort and wealth. She was attracted to Mike's confidence and efficiency. He was a man she could rely on, kind, considerate, and loyal. He surrounded Denise with care, fulfilled all her requests, dreamed of a happy family. In 1994, they got married. Their marriage seemed ideal. Two young, ambitious people built a successful life. Mike became one of the best real estate agents in Tallahassee, and Denise got a job in the banking sector. Soon they had a daughter, and to those around them, they became the model family. But over time, cracks began to appear. Mike, despite his success, remained a simple man who liked hunting, nature, sitting with friends. Denise dreamed of a luxurious life, expensive restaurants, travel, status in society. She became more demanding, irritable, and their relationship became strained. Since his high school years, Mike had a best friend, Brian Winchester. They grew up together, studied, played sports, and later worked in the same business. Their friendship was a strong, time-tested one. Friends' wives also became friends. Kathy Winchester and Denise often spent time together, discussing family matters. The two families more than once went on vacation, celebrated holidays. At first glance, Brian was as loyal and reliable as Mike. They hunted together, discussed business, supported each other in difficult moments. 6 months before his disappearance, Mike took out a large accident insurance policy, almost $2 million. It was a substantial sum, but no one paid much attention to it at the time. Mike worked in a risky field, hunted, often went outdoors, and insurance seemed a logical step. However, one remarkable fact is that the insurance agent who drew up the documents was Brian Winchester. More importantly, Denise was the sole beneficiary of the policy. December 16, 2000 started out as a very ordinary day. Mike, as planned, got up early in the morning, put on his camouflage clothes, and prepared to hunt. Lake Seminole, where he went, was his favorite place. He had known those waters since he was a boy and had hunted there many times. Duck hunting was his tradition, and this time nothing boded ill. At about 5:30 a.m., he kissed his wife, quietly looked out into the nursery where his young daughter was sleeping, and left the house. Got in his truck and headed out to the lake. The weather that day was cool and the water was covered with a light mist. Mike arrived at the location, launched the boat, and set sail. He was never seen again after that. On that day, December 16, 2000, no one immediately suspected anything wrong. The duck hunt might have gone on long enough. Mike might have lingered on the water, deciding to enjoy the quiet of nature, but the longer he was gone, the more concern grew. Around lunchtime, Brian Winchester began to worry. He knew that Mike had gone to Lake Seminole and should have been home by now. Along with his father, he decided to drive to the hunting spot to make sure his friend was okay. When they arrived at the lake, they noticed Mike's car parked near the shore, a green Ford Bronco. The car was parked neatly, as if the owner had just stepped away for a while, but he himself was nowhere to be seen. Inside the car, everything looked familiar. No signs of struggle, nothing suspicious. One thing was alarming, however. There was no Mike's boat near the shore. Brian and his father began to look around the shore, shouting his name, but there was only silence. It became clear something had happened. Realizing that they would not be able to find out anything on their own, Brian contacted the authorities. First on the scene were staff from the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission. Their experience with bodies of water gave them hope of finding the missing man quickly. The first search was organized. They used boats, explored the coast, tried to determine where Mike's boat could be. However, the search soon had to be interrupted. A strong storm began. The wind raised the waves, the water became murky, and the rain sharply reduced visibility. In such conditions, further investigation of the water body was impossible. The rescuers were forced to postpone the search until better weather conditions. When the weather improved, the search resumed with even greater scope. Divers scoured the bottom of the lake, hoping to find the body or at least some clues. Sonar boats were brought in, and on-land patrols scoured the shoreline. However, the results were nil. Lake Seminole is a vast expanse of water full of underwater hiding places, snags, and submerged trees. Its murky waters prevented clear visibility, making it difficult for rescuers. However, despite their efforts, no body, no signs of struggle, and no personal belongings of Mike were found. Some began to question whether he had actually drowned. In similar cases, at least some remains had surfaced or washed ashore. However, a few days later, a search party found Mike's boat. It was drifting close to shore, virtually untouched. The discovery of the boat raised a new stream of questions. First, the boat had not been overturned. If Mike had actually encountered an underwater obstacle, his boat would probably have capsized, but it didn't. Secondly, a hunting rifle was found in the boat in a case. This fact indicated that Mike hadn't even started hunting. Any experienced hunter would have deployed the gun immediately after arriving at the site, because on Lake Seminole, ducks met at dawn, and it was the morning hours were considered the most successful for hunting. It all seemed strange. If Mike had drowned accidentally, his body should have surfaced within a few days. but it was nowhere to be found. Despite the lack of concrete evidence, after some time, investigators concluded that Mike Williams was most likely the victim of an accident. According to the official version, his boat hit an underwater stump hidden in the murky waters of Lake Seminole. As a result of the sharp impact, Mike lost his balance and fell overboard. Because he was wearing heavy boots and thick hunting clothes, his shoes quickly filled with water, weighing down his body and preventing him from climbing back into the boat. Unable to stay on the surface, Mike went underwater and soon drowned. The investigators could not be definitively sure of this because the body was never found. However, they hypothesized that Mike's remains could be prey to alligators inhabiting the lake. In their opinion, that is why, after months of searching, failed to find any bones or other traces of his death. This version was officially recognized as the main one, and the case gradually began to wind down. However, there were those who did not believe in this theory. The version that Mike Williams drowned and was eaten by alligators did not seem convincing to his mother, Cheryl Williams. She knew that in such cases, at least some remains are bound to remain: bones, fragments of clothing, objects that were with the person. But after weeks and months of searching, they found absolutely nothing. The more time passed, the more anxious Cheryl became. She realized that even in an environment like Lake Seminole, the body should have surfaced in a few days or at least been swept ashore by underwater currents. But the water seemed to swallow her son without a trace. In addition, experienced investigators began to wonder, if Mike really drowned, why was his boat left in perfect condition? If he had fallen overboard, the boat should have either capsized or at the very least gotten wet on the inside. However, there were no signs of struggle or emergency inside. It looked as if Mike hadn't even started hunting. But despite the mounting questions, there was no hard evidence for the investigation. The search, which had lasted weeks, had yielded not a single significant lead. With no body, no witnesses, no obvious signs of a crime, the authorities had no choice but to accept Mike's death as a tragic accident. Cheryl, however, didn't believe that. Something was wrong, and the more she thought about her son's disappearance, the more it seemed to her that the official explanation was not just wrong, but deliberately hiding the truth. Years passed, but the mystery of Mike Williams' disappearance remained unsolved. Then the investigation gained momentum, then again came to a standstill. In different years, from 2004 to 2011, investigators again and again turned to this case, but each time it was closed. The only person who didn't give up and kept demanding answers was his mother, Cheryl Williams. She did not believe in the official version and believed that her son was not eaten by alligators, and someone deliberately tried to hide the truth. Over the years, Cheryl wrote letters, met with detectives, and tried to get media attention. She believed that if she kept pushing the investigation, sooner or later the truth would come out. Cheryl became not only the voice of her son, but a real force that kept the case from fading into oblivion. After years of investigation, there are still new findings. During the next stage of the search, boots and a jacket belonging to Mike were found. The most important item was the jacket. In one of its pockets was a hunting license issued in Mike's name. This proved beyond a doubt that the items found belonged to him. But what alarmed the investigators the most was the condition of the clothes. The boots, jacket, and ID looked virtually untouched. They were not torn, tattered, or damaged, which strongly contradicted the alligator attack. If Mike's body had really fallen victim to wild animals, nothing would have been left of the clothes. The teeth and claws of alligators would have left obvious marks. However, this was not the case. This discovery was the first serious blow to the official version of his disappearance. In addition to Mike's mother, many acquaintances and family friends also doubted the official version of events. First, Mike did not like to hunt alone. Everyone who knew him said that he always called his friends to go duck hunting with him. For him, it was a tradition, hunting in the company, discussing plans, evenings sitting around the campfire. But that day, for some reason, he went alone. Secondly, Mike was an extremely cautious man. Everyone recalled that his water safety techniques were amazingly pedantic. He never sailed a boat with boots on. That was his ironclad rule. Every time he swam away from the shore, he took off his boots because he knew that if he accidentally went overboard, the heavy shoes could drag him to the bottom. But the official version said that it was the boots that prevented him from saving himself. This fact raised serious questions. How could a man who had been cautious all his life ignore his own rules that day? In addition, local experts questioned the main argument of the investigation, that Mike's body was allegedly completely destroyed by alligators. The fact is that December is the cold season in Florida, and alligators at this time are in a state of torpor. They do not attack and practically do not eat in winter as their metabolism slows down. Consequently, the version that predators attacked and completely destroyed the body looked extremely unlikely. All these facts only strengthened the suspicions. Against this background, the behavior of the two people who seemed to be most concerned about Mike's fate stood out. His wife Denise and best friend Brian Winchester did not show the slightest desire to pursue the investigation. They accepted the version of the accident unquestioningly. Moreover, after receiving nearly $2 million in insurance money, Denise quickly accepted the loss. It wasn't long before she was starting a new chapter of her life. And the best part is with whom. Denise married Brian Winchester, her late husband's best friend. This couldn't help but arouse suspicion from those around her. Too many things in this story looked strange and raised questions. Mike disappeared under mysterious circumstances. His body was never found despite a lengthy search. Usually, even if a person drowns, the water after some time brings out at least fragments of clothing or remains, but in this case there were absolutely no traces. The official version of the investigation, according to which he drowned and was eaten by alligators, looked less and less plausible because of the many inconsistencies. In addition, Denise acted as if her husband's death was not particularly shaken. She easily made an insurance payment and soon lived a new life as if nothing had happened. The most suspicious was the fact that sometime later, Denise married Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. Many saw a hidden meaning in this strange marriage, but the investigation still had no direct evidence to prove the crime. For Cheryl, this was the final proof that her son was the victim of a conspiracy. Without hard evidence, however, she could prove nothing. As the years passed, the truth remained deeply hidden. On August 6, 2016, an event occurred in the small town of Tallahassee that shocked the locals. At first glance, it was just a family affair, but in reality, it was the key to solving one of the most mysterious mysteries of the past 2 decades. That day, Brian Winchester kidnapped his wife, Denise. It would seem that the man who for years had remained on the sidelines in the case of the mysterious disappearance of Mike Williams had suddenly committed the crime himself. But in fact, that was only the beginning. It all started early in the morning when Denise Winchester left the house as usual and headed to her car to drive to work. She didn't even realize she was being watched. As soon as she opened the door and got into the passenger compartment, Brian suddenly appeared from behind her. He had hidden in the back seat beforehand and was patiently waiting for the moment to take her by surprise. He clutched a gun in his hand, and as soon as Denise was inside, he moved forward sharply, pointing the weapon threateningly in her face. His breathing was heavy, and his voice trailed off into a scream. He wasn't going to let her go that easily. To him, divorce meant the complete destruction of the life they'd been working toward for years. It wasn't just a breakup. It was a betrayal he couldn't accept. Brian was in a state of extreme nervousness. His hands were shaking, his emotions were overwhelming him, and at one point he even turned the gun on himself. It seemed to him that if he lost Denise, he would no longer have any meaning in his life. He had backed himself into a corner, seeing no other option but to force her to stay close by using fear and pressure. Denise realized that any careless word could have irreparable consequences. She tried to keep her cool despite the obvious threat. Gradually, she managed to convince Brian that they could talk things over and that they should not make any hasty decisions. She assured him that she would not go to the police and that they still had a chance to make things right. Those words had an effect on Brian. He began to calm down, his grip loosened, and after a few hours he finally decided to let her go. He was sure Denise would keep her word and not betray him. But once she was free, she didn't hesitate to go to the police and file a report. After Denise's statement, the police quickly found Brian. He was arrested and charged with kidnapping and threatening to kill. At the trial, he looked lost. He already knew he could not escape punishment. In December 2017, he was sentenced to 20 years in prison. It seemed like just a family drama that got out of hand. But in fact, it was the key to solving the most high-profile crime of recent years. Once behind bars, Brian Winchester remained silent for a long time. He hoped that he would be able to cope with the situation, but with each passing day, he realized, now he is completely out of control. His power over Denise was gone, she had betrayed him, and worst of all, he was all alone. For the first time in years, he felt helpless. The once carefully thought-out plan had crumbled, and there was no way out anymore. After much thought, Brian realized that the only thing he had left was the truth. He had nothing to lose, so he decided to speak up. In one of his interrogations, he made a shocking confession. Mike Williams was not killed in an accident, he was murdered. Brian told how it all happened, and this moment became a turning point in the case, which for many years remained unsolved. They'd been in love since high school, but they were both married. Divorce? That was unacceptable to Denise. In their circle, divorce was considered a disgrace. It would mean condemnation from family, church, society. Denise wanted them to be together, but she didn't want to ruin her image as the perfect wife and mother. Then they had another option. Brian confessed that they realized that if Mike was not alive, all the problems would disappear by themselves. Denise would get the insurance and no one would suspect a thing. They decided to kill Mike. The day Mike Williams was killed, Brian was waiting for him at Lake Seminole. When Mike arrived to hunt, Brian got into his boat. They got out on the water and Brian said they should check out one good place to hunt. When they got far enough out, he jumped on Mike and pushed him overboard. He was floundering in the water, trying to stay on the surface. That's when Brian pulled out his gun and shot him. Mike died instantly, and Brian moved his body to another spot and buried it. Then he returned to the lake to fake the accident. Where was the body? Brian told the investigators where they had hidden Mike's remains. The police immediately went to the location Winchester had given them. They found the body. It was buried deep underground. Despite the time, the remains were in good enough condition to be forensically examined. Investigators took DNA samples and compared them to Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. 18 years after Mike's disappearance, his body was finally found. It was now clear. He hadn't drowned, he'd been murdered. Denise's arrest. After these confessions, the investigation finally had the evidence that had been missing for so long. When questioned, she tried to defend herself. She said that Brian had threatened her, that he forced her into the conspiracy, that she didn't want to kill him. But the interrogators already knew the truth. They knew that Denise and Brian had been together for years. They knew that her marriage to Mike was a sham. And most importantly, they knew that Denise was the mastermind behind the murder. She didn't want to lose her reputation. She didn't want to suffer the shame of divorce. But she wanted to be with Brian and get the insurance money. Denise's choice was fatal. Now she had to answer for her actions in court. The arrest of Denise Williams became a real sensation. Almost 18 years after the disappearance of Mike Williams, the investigation finally had undeniable evidence of her involvement in the crime. Now she had to stand trial and answer for what she had done. The prosecution was based on the confession of Brian Winchester, who detailed the conspiracy, the murder, the staged accident, and the motive for the crime. In addition to his testimony, the investigation had physical evidence, including Mike's remains and proof of insurance fraud. The case garnered tremendous public outcry. Tallahassee citizens who had once sympathized with Denise were now horrified to realize that she had deliberately orchestrated her husband's murder for money and a life with Brian. The prosecutor's office brought 3 serious charges against Denise Williams. First, she was found to be the organizer of a conspiracy to murder Mike Williams. Second, she was charged with insurance fraud. Third, she was charged with aiding and abetting first-degree murder. Prosecutors said Denise was a key figure in the conspiracy. Not only was she involved in planning the murder, but she actively contributed to its cover-up, misleading everyone for years. Denise's attorneys built a defense on her allegedly passive role in the crime. They argued that she was the victim of manipulation by Brian, who forced her to participate by threatening her. In addition, the defense tried to refute accusations that Denise orchestrated the murder for insurance money, arguing that she never showed any particular interest in her husband's money. But those arguments were shattered in court. The prosecutor's office presented evidence of Denise and Brian's long-standing affair, proving that Mike's murder was a carefully planned move for the sake of their future together and financial gain. During the trial, the prosecution presented the testimony of Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother. She described how she had fought for justice for years, how she had faced resistance from Denise, and how she had suspected her of lying all these years. Also presented in court were phone records of Denise and Brian, which showed that they had been in contact after Mike's disappearance, which confirmed their conspiracy. The main witness, Brian Winchester, detailed how they planned the murder, what they did afterward, and how Denise suggested waiting until Mike was officially declared dead to get insurance. His testimony was so exhaustive that Denise's defense could not refute it. On December 14, 2018, a Leon County jury found Denise Williams guilty of conspiracy to murder, insurance fraud, and aiding and abetting first-degree murder. On February 17, 2019, she was sentenced to life without parole for conspiracy to murder and accessory to murder, and an additional 30-year term for insurance fraud. In 2020, Denise Williams appealed, and the trial panel reversed her conviction. First, she avoided a conviction for fraud. To dismiss the charge, she turned over the entire amount of the insurance payout and the house to her daughter, thereby recouping the money she received and formally avoiding punishment for the financial crime. Second, the court dismissed the charge of accessory to murder because there was no direct evidence that she directly participated in or assisted in the crime. Despite Brian Winchester's admission that the murder was committed as part of their conspiracy, there was no legal basis at that time to consider Denise an actual accomplice to the murder, because she was not present at the crime scene. So, in 2020, the court vacated the fraud and accessory to murder charges and changed the sentence. The new sentence was 30 years imprisonment for conspiracy to murder. Paige Bergfeld was born on April 27, 1973, in Denver, Colorado, to Frank and Suzanne Bergfeld. She was the eldest daughter in the family, and from childhood was characterized by vividness of mind, energy, and determination. Her parents raised her in the spirit of independence and hard work. From a young age, Paige was unusually active. She participated in school plays, played sports, and was fond of music. In high school, her friends and teachers described her as friendly, cheerful, and incredibly charismatic. Paige was successful in school. She was attracted to entrepreneurship and business, and as a teenager, she showed commercial acumen. Her parents recalled that while she was still in school, she organized mini businesses, selling handmade jewelry, making small souvenirs, and reselling school supplies to her classmates. After high school, she attended the University of Miami, Ohio, where she studied business and marketing. Her desire for independence manifested itself during her college years. She studied and worked part-time at the same time, not wanting to depend on her parents. During this time, she met Ron Bagler, a young man who was older than her and worked in finance. Their romance developed quickly, and soon Paige accepted a marriage proposal. In 1995, Paige married Ron Bagler, but their marriage did not last long. The young couple faced different views on the future. Paige dreamed of a family and children, and Ron did not want to have children. The differences became more and more apparent, and in 1997 they divorced. Despite the separation, they maintained their friendship, and years later they became close again, but as friends. After the divorce, Paige did not give up. She continued to build her career, opened several businesses. She sold baby carriers for babies, taught dancing for babies, and organized classes for parents. She dreamed of creating a successful business that would secure her future. In the late 1990s, she met Rob Dixon, a charming and successful businessman with whom she began a serious relationship. They married in 1998 and soon had 3 children. At first, everything seemed perfect. a large house, financial stability, a prosperous family. But soon in their relationship began to appear problems. Rob was losing business, experiencing financial difficulties, and with it became irritable and aggressive. In 2005, Paige sued her husband, accusing him of domestic violence. According to her, he threatened to kill their children if she left him. After a difficult divorce in 2006, Paige was left alone with 3 children and huge debts. Her lifestyle changed completely. She was now the sole breadwinner for the family. She continued to run her business, but money was tight. After her divorce from Rob Dixon, Paige found herself in a difficult situation. She was left alone with 3 children, forced to independently provide for the family. A large house, which once seemed a cozy nest, now became an impossible financial burden. But Paige never complained. She looked for ways out, tried to earn money in different ways. Her entrepreneurial spirit kept her going. She continued to sell baby carriers, taught dance classes for babies, and looked for new ideas. She worked long hours a day, sparing no effort to make sure her children never lacked anything. Despite her busy schedule, she always made time for her family. She helped with homework, organized trips to the park, and never missed a parent-teacher conference. In the eyes of others, she remained a strong, independent woman who managed to combine everything: work, motherhood, personal life. No one could not think that there was something in her life about which she preferred to keep silent. June 28, 2007, a Thursday, started out normally for Paige. In the morning, she woke up the kids, got them ready for school, and then took care of business. That afternoon, she had to drive to the neighboring town of Eagle to meet Ron Bagler, her first husband. They agreed to see each other in the afternoon, spent time together, talked, and then Paige drove back to Grand Junction. On the way home, she called Ron to make sure he'd gotten there safely, then continued on her way. Work awaited her in the evening. The kids were staying with the babysitter, and she had to meet with a client. On the way back, she talked on the phone, clarified matters, and made plans for the evening. Later, her phone activity stopped abruptly. Her children and nanny were waiting for her at home. According to people close to her, she always returned on time. If she was late, she gave notice. But that night, Paige never returned. The next morning, her friend Barbara Campbell began to worry. Paige had always kept her word, and now she wasn't answering her cell phone. Paige's children began to panic. Her 8-year-old daughter Jess left several anxious voicemails begging her mom to come back. 2 days passed, but Paige never showed up. On June 30, her father, Frank Bergfield, received a call from the police. His daughter had been officially reported missing. He knew immediately something terrible had happened. When the police officially declared Paige Bergfield missing, her family sprang into action immediately. Her father, Frank Bergfield, who lived in Denver, immediately dropped everything and traveled to Grand Junction. He realized that his daughter would never leave his children without an explanation, and he had no doubt something serious had happened. The missing persons report shocked her brother Craig too. When he heard the call from his father, he felt his voice shake with tears for the first time in years. It wasn't just a wake-up call for the family. It was a disaster. Paige's children, especially her 8-year-old daughter Jess, were in a state of confusion and panic. She tried to call her mother, leaving voice messages begging her to come home. The house filled with anxiety with each passing hour, and still no word from Paige. It had been 2 days since she had last been in touch, but no friends, family, or co-workers had been able to contact her. It was then that the nanny who was staying with the children made the decision to contact the police. She took Jess with her and went to the station to report Paige's disappearance. When the girl stood in front of the officers, she could barely hold back her tears. She kept repeating the same thing. Her mom always keeps her promises, and if she said she was coming home, then that was the way it was supposed to be. This statement finally convinced the police that the situation could not be left unattended. After receiving the official report of the disappearance, the police immediately began their investigation. The first thing investigators began to do was to gather information about Paige's life, her daily routes and habits. In the first stages, 3 possible versions of her disappearance were considered. The first hypothesis was a voluntary disappearance, but according to relatives, this option was absolutely excluded. Paige would never leave her children and would not break all contact without explanation. The second version was an accident. There was a possibility that she had been in an accident or had been attacked. However, the absence of signals from her phone and credit card suggested that if the accident had happened, it was not accidental. The last hypothesis, the most disturbing, suggested a crime. But so far, police had no concrete evidence pointing to violent behavior. Police's first steps were to look around Paige's home and talk to her loved ones. Detectives hoped to find some clues, but all indications were that the woman had no intention of leaving for long. Her belongings were still in their places. There were no signs of a struggle in the house, and no documents or personal items had been touched. On the third day after the missing person was reported, there was an unexpected turn in the investigation. A few kilometers outside of town, a car was found completely engulfed in flames. When the police arrived on the scene, it was clear it was a red Ford Focus belonging to Paige. From the first minutes, detectives realized that the fire was arson. The car was in a remote location, away from other vehicles or buildings, eliminating the possibility of accidental ignition. Experts immediately concluded that the fire was used to destroy possible evidence. After a thorough examination of the burned vehicle, forensic experts concluded that the hearth of the fire was located in the driver's seat area. This indicated that the perpetrator had purposefully destroyed the part of the car where fingerprints or other traces could have been left. The strangest thing, however, was the position of the front seat. It had been pushed back so far that a man of Paige's stature would not have been physically able to drive the car. That meant that someone much taller than her had been driving the last time. That fact could help give us an idea of the possible culprit. Although most of the items inside the car were destroyed by the fire, one item survived. Paige's day planner was found in the car, but its pages were torn out. What alarmed investigators the most was the exact dates that had been removed. Missing were entries for June 26, 27, 28, and 29, the exact days Paige disappeared. It looked as if someone was trying to hide information about her meetings or contacts during that period. Police realized this was no accident. Someone had deliberately deleted the pages, wanting to erase important information. However, it was not yet clear who did this and what information they were trying to hide. After the discovery of the burned-out car, the case of Paige's disappearance officially became a criminal investigation. While there had previously been hope that she might have simply left for personal reasons, it was now clear that her disappearance was connected to a crime. But despite all the findings, the police still had no suspects. The only thing they realized for sure was that Paige Bergfeld wasn't just missing, she was the victim of someone else's carefully planned crime. After it became clear that Paige Bergfeld was not just missing, but could have been the victim of a crime, police launched a massive search. The Mesa County area was huge, about 3,300 square miles, and investigators had to cover vast stretches of desert and inaccessible terrain. The operation was supported by volunteers, family members, and friends of Paige, who wanted to do everything they could to find her. Her brother Craig Bergfeld temporarily left his life in Seattle to join the search. He and his father drove around the neighborhood, hoping to find at least some clue that might answer the question of what happened to his sister. Meanwhile, the police began to investigate possible motives for the crime. Paige's ex-husbands were the first to come under suspicion. The first person detectives looked at was her second husband, Rob Dixon. Their marriage lasted from 1998 to 2026, and during that time there were many conflicts and crises in their relationship. When Dixon lost his business and faced financial problems, his character changed. He became irritable, irascible, and unpredictable. It was during this period that the first serious conflicts in their family appeared, which eventually led to divorce. During Dixon's background investigation, police found a recording of a 911 call Paige made in 2004. On that day, she told the dispatcher that her husband had threatened her with terrible violence. He was supposed to watch the children while she was at work, she said, but became angry and told her that when she returned she would find them dead. Despite the severity of the allegation, the police did not charge him at the time. But that fact now mattered. The following year, in 2005, the situation repeated itself, and Page went to the police again, but now with a complaint of battery. Dixon was then charged with third-degree assault, but after a hearing he was able to negotiate a plea deal on a less serious charge of domestic harassment. He was eventually given a suspended sentence, and the incident was soon hushed up. But that event was the last straw. A year later, they divorced. Page's financial situation at that time was also difficult. After the divorce, she was left with debts, a large house, and 3 children in her care. Her mortgage costs exceeded $6,000 a month, and her income, despite several sources of income, was unstable. All these facts led police to scrutinize Dixon, but he was soon ruled out as a suspect. At the time of Page's disappearance, he was in Philadelphia, and cell tower data confirmed that his phone had not left the city. Moreover, upon learning of his ex-wife's disappearance, he immediately traveled to Colorado and offered his assistance to the investigation. The next person to whom detectives turned their attention was Page's first husband, Ron Bagler. They were married for only 2 years, from 1995 to 1997, and the reason for their separation was disagreement over children. Page dreamed of having a family, and Bagler was not ready for fatherhood. Despite the divorce, they maintained their friendship and even started socializing again after her breakup with Dix. He last saw her on June 28, 2007, the same day she disappeared. They agreed to meet in the small town of Eagle, which was between their places of residence. They spent a few hours together that day, and when they parted ways, Page called him to make sure he got home safely. That was the last time anyone spoke to her. Bagler called the police himself when he learned Page was missing. He informed investigators that she couldn't have just left the house without an explanation. Cell phone data confirmed what he said. He was indeed in Denver, hours away from Grand Junction, when Page disappeared. Police have since ruled him out as a suspect. A few days later, as police continued their search, a random driver with a flat tire found a checkbook on the ground on the side of the road leading from Grand Junction to the southeast. When it was turned over to police, it turned out to belong to Paige Bergfeld. Soon other items were found nearby: insurance cards, driver's licenses, bank cards. They were scattered along the road in small groups, as if someone had deliberately left a trail. Police speculated that perhaps Paige herself, already in danger, may have been trying to signal her movement. These findings led investigators to look even more closely at her recent movements and contacts. That's when they discovered her secret cell phone, which she used to lead a second, hidden life. Police determined that Paige worked as an escort. Under the alias Carrie, she ran an agency called Models, Inc., offering massage and escort services to clients. For a long time, none of her family or friends knew about the business. In the late 1990s, she danced at a strip club in Denver and later organized her own agency network. A review of her financial transactions and phone records revealed that her escort work helped her cope financially, but also put her at serious risk. Her clients included a variety of men, but not all of them behaved appropriately. After this discovery, the circle of suspects widened. The police began to cross-check all the clients who had contacted Paige shortly before her disappearance. There were several people on the list, but one in particular caught their attention. It was Lester Ralph Jones, a man who had previously been in trouble with the law for sexual assault and kidnapping. His name appeared in Paige's phone records the day before she disappeared. He called her several times trying to set up a meeting. Up until that point, the investigation had been wandering in the dark, but now they had a viable suspect. After carefully analyzing the phone records, investigators were able to weed out all possible suspects except for one man, Lester Ralph Jones. This 55-year-old mechanic worked at Bob Scott RV's workshop in Grand Junction. He was one of the people who tried to arrange a meeting with Paige the day before she disappeared. Investigators learned that Paige was already acquainted with Jones. Their first meeting took place as part of her job as an escort, but the woman experienced negative emotions after interacting with this client. She even avoided further contact with him, passing on his requests to co-workers. On the day Jones again sought a meeting with her, Paige offered to send Carol Linder home instead. a woman who sometimes performed massage services for her agency. Linderholm later recalled that she felt uncomfortable the moment she crossed the threshold of Jones's home. The man made a repulsive impression on her. Tall and massive, he made it clear that he expected more than just a massage. Linderholm refused to meet his demands but still gave him a short treatment, being careful not to engage in conflict. Afterward, she left with an uneasy feeling of foreboding. Detectives investigated Jones' possible connection to Page's disappearance, but they needed more evidence. Then they discovered an important nuance. His workplace at Bob Scott RVs was literally across the street from where Page's burned-out car was found. This coincidence looked too suspicious. In addition, another interesting detail surfaced. Recalling the examination of the car, the detectives noticed that the driver's seat had been pushed backwards. This indicated that the last person to sit behind the wheel was a tall man. Lester Jones fit that description. When the police first contacted Lester Jones, he did not avoid contact. On July 5, 2007, detectives came to his office, and he agreed to voluntarily talk to them. The interview lasted 2.5 hours, during which time Jones was calm and confident. He denied any involvement in Page's disappearance and stated that he did not know what had happened to her. He also provided his fingerprints, DNA samples, and gave the police the keys to his white Dodge pickup. So far, there was nothing suspicious in his behavior, but investigators did not believe him. Before Paige Bergfeld disappeared, her work phone received numerous calls. Police discovered that one caller was calling from a track phone burner phone, an inexpensive cell phone that can be used anonymously. That phone was activated the day before Paige disappeared. It was used only 5 times and then stopped ringing altogether. Jones vehemently denied ever having one. However, during a search of his home and workplace, police found an empty track phone box that had been thrown in the trash. This discovery was a turning point in the investigation. Detectives went to the local Walmart where the phone was purchased and requested surveillance footage. What they saw left no doubt. On the screen was Lester Jones, wearing the same clothes in which he came to the first interview with the police. The investigation now had the irrefutable fact that Jones was lying. After obtaining the videos, police conducted a more thorough search of both Jones' home and his workplace. As a result, investigators found several disturbing items. Among them were a woman's bra that did not belong to his wife, several men's wigs, and a gasoline canister. The items discovered raised many questions. Given that Page's car had been deliberately burned, the presence of the gas can was highly suspicious. In addition, among the items found were a Viagra packet and a supply of condoms, possibly indicating his intentions on the day of Page's disappearance. Despite numerous pieces of circumstantial evidence, the police could not press charges. The main problem was the lack of a body. Until Paige Bergfeld's body was found, the charges against Lester Jones remained only speculation. Investigators felt he was guilty, but they lacked the final piece of evidence that could put the case to rest. The case froze in suspense. Jones remained at large, and Paige was officially missing. The fateful discovery 5 years later. In March 2012, 5 long years after Page's disappearance, a random hiker walking along the highway discovered human remains. They were in a dried-up riverbed among rocks, dry bushes, and branches. After examining the site, experts immediately realized that the remains belonged to a woman. For the final identification was carried out comparison with dental records and then DNA analysis. The results confirmed the scary part. It was Paige Bergfeld. The remains showed that she had been bound and duct-taped, indicating that she had been forcibly restrained. The police now had all the evidence they needed to apprehend Lester Jones. In November 2014, more than 7 years after Page's disappearance, Mesa County Police arrested Lester Jones. He was charged with kidnapping and first-degree murder. After years of uncertainty, the investigation was finally nearing its climax. But there was a trial ahead where the prosecution had to prove Jones' guilt, despite the lack of direct physical evidence. The Lester Jones trial began in July 2016, 9 years after Paige Bergfeld disappeared. Prosecutors presented a detailed picture of what they believe happened the night she disappeared. The main motive for the murder that the prosecution voiced was that Jones was a violent man with a history of violence against women. He had a history of trouble with the law for kidnapping and assault, and may have killed Paige when he realized he could not meet her again after their first encounter. During the trial, Jess Dixon, Paige's 17-year-old daughter, took the stand and recounted how her mother disappeared when she was just 8 years old. She recalled the desperation and fear she felt in the days when she tried to reach her mother by leaving voice messages. Also testifying at the trial was Frank Bergfeld, Paige's father, who gave an emotional account of what a wonderful mother and woman his daughter was. He talked about how her life was filled with caring for her children and work, and that she would never have left her family voluntarily. A significant moment in the trial was the testimony of Lisa Nance, the ex-wife of Lester Jones. She recounted that in the late 1990s he kidnapped her at gunpoint and threatened to kill her. When she began dating another man, Jones stalked them, shot the rival, and then tried to subjugate her to his will again. A month after this incident, he broke into her home and forcibly took her away in a car, threatening to drown her in a lake where no one would find her. Nance's recollections showed that Jones was capable of violence, especially when he felt he was losing control over women. Lester Jones himself refused to testify in court. However, prosecutors presented an audio recording of a conversation he had with police shortly after his initial interview. During the call, the officer informed him that police had completed their search of his vehicles and he could pick them up. Jones abruptly replied that he was not going to do so. When the officer expressed bewilderment, Jones uttered the phrase, "Are you asking me where I might bury the body?" This statement, made 5 years before Paige's remains were found, shocked investigators. It sounded as if he had confessed to the crime himself. A few days after the call, Jones attempted suicide by taking sleeping pills. Before doing so, he wrote a note in which he claimed he was innocent but could no longer tolerate the police harassment. The trial lasted 22 days, after which the jury was unable to reach a consensus. This led to the trial being declared a mistrial and a new trial being ordered. The prosecutors immediately decided that they would seek a retrial because the evidence was very compelling, but too long and difficult for the jury to hear. The second trial began on November 21, 2016, just 10 weeks after the first. This time, prosecutors emphasized key points to avoid overloading the evidence. Among the new facts presented to the court was a surveillance video outside Paige's office that shows a white Chevrolet Impala driving slowly around her car. The police discovered that this car belonged to Lester Jones' wife, and she was away at the time of Paige's disappearance. This discovery confirmed that in the days before her disappearance, Jones had been following Paige. 4 days of deliberations later, the jury reached its final verdict. On December 23, 2016, a Mesa County court found Lester Ralph Jones guilty of the following crimes: first-degree murder, felony murder, murder during the commission of another crime, second-degree murder, and kidnapping. On January 30, 2017, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Rhonda Casto was born on October 23, 1986 in Portland, Oregon, to Julia Simmons. From an early age, Rhonda was surrounded by her mother's love, but her life was not always cloudless. Despite her mother's best efforts, the family was not wealthy, and Rhonda knew from a young age that she would have to fight for her dreams. Rhonda was an ambitious but also sensitive and caring girl, which was combined with her desire for independence. As a teenager, she had a passion for fashion and dreamed of becoming a model, which was quite difficult in the small town she lived in. However, Rhonda always believed that if she worked hard, one day her dreams would come true. Rhonda attended the local high school, and although her studies were nothing special to her, she was actively involved in the school and dreamed of more. After graduating from high school, she did not go to university but decided to pursue a career in modeling and beauty. Realized that she needed to go beyond her hometown, but at that moment Rhonda did not know how to do it. However, her life changed dramatically in 2005 when her mother Julia rented a room in Stephen Nichols' apartment. At that time, Rhonda was still a young woman who lacked stability and confidence in the future. It was then that Rhonda met Stephen, and as she later told her friends, her jaw dropped when she first saw him. Stephen was 27 years old and 8 years older than Rhonda, but despite this age difference, there was an immediate strong attraction between them. Rhonda and Stephen began to spend a lot of time together, and soon their relationship became more serious. Their connection developed rapidly, and soon Rhonda and Stephen became a couple. It is important to note that their relationship was full of both passionate moments and conflicts. Stephen was more mature and experienced, while Rhonda was energetic and open-minded, which attracted him but also caused arguments at times. Problems in the relationship began to show when Rhonda gave birth to their daughter in 2008. Becoming a mother took her even deeper into caring for her family and her daughter. Rhonda was a wonderful mother. Her loved ones remarked how much she loved her baby girl and how carefully she cared for her despite her own worries and problems. Rhonda missed her former freedom, but she still stayed in the relationship, trying to make it work for her daughter's sake. Nevertheless, their relationship became more strained each year. Rhonda became increasingly vocal about her concerns about Nichols and his character. This was expressed in the words she once said to her best friend Jessica Colburn, "He's either going to propose to me or kill me." The phrase seemed to be said in jest, but amid their growing quarrels and resentment, her relationship with Stephen began to seem more troubling. On March 16, 2009, the couple decided to go on a hike to spend the day outdoors and perhaps refresh their relationship. Stephen suggested that Rhonda take a hike on the popular Eagle Creek Trail, which is a 45-minute drive from Portland. The place was famous for its natural beauty, but also for its dangerous terrain. Narrow sections of the trail with steep slopes and cliffs were known for accidents. Rhonda and Stephen hoped that the day would be a good day to spend time together, get some fresh air, and strengthen their bond. They decided that the hike would be an opportunity for them to take a break from their daily routine and strengthen their relationship, which had recently left much to be desired. On the day of the tragedy, the morning was fresh and clear, and it looked like everything was going to be fine. However, the weather soon changed. It began to rain, and gradually the conditions on the trail became more dangerous. The trail became slippery, especially in some parts where ice and snow covered not only the ground but also the rocks themselves. Stephen and Rhonda kept walking despite the rain and icy trail, for they did not expect this walk to end in tragedy. Rhonda jokingly threw a towel over her shoulders and pretended to be Supergirl, running down the trail despite the dangers that lurked in her path. At one point, she lost her balance and fell off the cliff before she could keep her footing. Stephen immediately called the police and medical help, reporting that his girlfriend had fallen off the cliff while hiking. The fact that he was with her at the time caught the attention of investigators, but at the time, no one could have guessed how complicated the investigation would turn out to be. The Eagle Creek Trail, located 45 minutes from Portland, Oregon, is one of the popular hiking spots among hikers. However, despite its beauty, it is known for its dangerous sections that have already caused several tragic incidents. The trail runs along the river and through its gorges. In some places it is very narrow and steep, with steep precipices that drop straight into deep abysses. Unusually scenic views, waterfalls, and verdant forests attract hundreds of hikers, but these sections of the trail also make the route extremely dangerous, especially for those who are unprepared or do not take into account the deteriorating weather conditions. On the day of the tragedy, March 16, 2009, the Eagle Creek Trail was experiencing variable weather that left nothing good for hiking. Things were relatively calm in the morning, but by the time Rhonda and Stephen began their hike, the weather began to deteriorate. It soon began to rain and the temperature dropped significantly. The snow that had not yet melted at the bottom of the trail mixed with the rain, turning the ground into an icy mass. In places, rocks and tree roots were slippery and the trail became dangerous, especially on steep inclines. Rhonda and Stephen kept moving forward despite the conditions without thinking about the consequences. However, the inexorable elements did take their toll. On one of the narrowest and most dangerous parts of the trail, Rhonda couldn't keep her balance and fell. The cliff was so steep that the fall was fatal. After Rhonda was at the bottom, Stephen immediately called emergency services, reporting that his girlfriend had fallen off the cliff while hiking. He tried to explain the circumstances of the accident, but there were some oddities in his story that later caught the attention of investigators. When the police and ambulance arrived at the scene around 6 p.m., they met with challenging conditions. The weather continued to deteriorate, with rain turning into a downpour and wind gusts getting stronger. Law enforcement and rescue personnel faced a real challenge. The trail was narrow and slippery, and the rain and fog limited visibility. Nevertheless, they were able to reach the scene of the fall about 40 minutes after the call. Rhonda's body was found at the bottom of the ravine, at the bottom of a steep cliff. Initial reports indicated that Rhonda was unconscious and in a lifeless state. The lack of signs of life immediately led officers to watch for possible evidence that she had not just fallen, but may have been subjected to some external force. No obvious signs of struggle or violence were found at the scene, which could support a theory of premeditated murder. Instead, police saw signs that Rhonda had slipped on a slippery and dangerous surface. Investigators began to scrutinize the scene. No footprints other than her own were found around Rhonda's body. The only noticeable element on the trail was a single trail leading directly to where she had fallen, as if Rhonda may have lost her balance at that exact spot and slipped off. Several details caught the investigators' attention. The shoe marks on the slippery trail were oddly placed, leading them to wonder if Rhonda might have been pushed or shoved at the moment she lost her balance. However, given the lack of other signs of violence or struggle, this theory has not been proven. The trail where the incident occurred was indeed dangerous, and not only locals but also officials were talking about it. There were rumors that there had been several accidents in the area in the past where people had fallen off cliffs. For example, in the same year, 4 people died as a result of falls from steep slopes in the area, including several accidents on nearby trails such as Eagle Creek. Rumor has it that these tragedies often occur on sections of the trail where the bluff drops into deep canyons. And in addition, it is often difficult to stay on the narrow and slippery surface. In the same year that the Rhonda tragedy occurred, police had already documented several accidents on the trail, which also impacted the investigation. This led investigators and experts to pay attention to possible features of the area, such as its natural characteristics. As noted by Hood River County Sheriff Matt English in 2009, the trail was very steep and narrow, and everything was pretty wet and slippery. There was also some snow in the parking lot area, which made the situation on the trail even more dangerous. After Rhonda's body was removed, investigators focused on analyzing her condition and the surrounding circumstances. Once down, she lay unconscious, and her body showed no obvious signs of injuries typical of falls from great heights, such as broken bones. However, it was important to understand whether her fall was the result of an accident, or perhaps it was triggered by some external influence. Stephen Nichols, in his own words, claimed that Rhonda went forward to overtake him when she slipped and fell off the cliff. Investigators pointed out several inconsistencies in Nichols' version. For example, the lack of other footprints on the trail in the area of Rhonda's fall, other than her own, raised doubts. Next, investigators continued to explore the possibilities that perhaps Rhonda could have been in some way forced or even pushed at that moment. Weather conditions and difficult terrain may have played a role in the incident, but it was also important to consider more subtle nuances, such as Stephen's behavior that day and his reactions to the incident. By the time the police reached the scene, the weather conditions had deteriorated even more. It was pouring rain, wind gusts had increased, and all attempts by investigators to move along the trail became increasingly difficult and dangerous. As the rain continued to intensify, several times during the investigation, local authorities stated that this weather may have been a deciding factor in what happened to Rhonda. Stephen Nichols was one of those people whose accounts of what happened changed more than once. When the tragedy first occurred, he claimed Rhonda's fall was an accident and didn't pay much attention to the strange questions she asked that day. But later, when Nichols agreed to be interviewed for the 48 Hours program, his story underwent a major change. Points that had previously been ignored or downplayed resurfaced, and his explanations began to sound unsettling and unclear, which only added to the doubts of investigators and the public. Stephen Nichols and Rhonda Casto went camping on March 16, 2009, according to Nichols, with the intention of spending time in nature, taking a break from everyday life and getting in shape. Rhonda, according to him, dreamed of regaining her former physical shape after giving birth. She had gained excess weight during her pregnancy, and Nichols suggested going on a hike so she could exercise and get back to her modeling career. According to him, the hike was just a way to maintain her health and get back to normal. However, for Rhonda, as it turned out, it wasn't just physical, but also psychological. Her thoughts and experiences that day were much more complicated. According to Nichols, the weather that day was perfect for the hike. According to him, he and Rhonda felt good and were in good spirits. He emphasized that his relationship with Rhonda was in a beautiful state at the time. This statement also raises questions, because other sources, including her best friend Jessica Colburn, said that their relationship had been difficult in recent months, full of arguments and resentment. On the day of the tragedy, Rhonda asked Stephen a strange and disturbing question several times that left him with an uneasy feeling. He claimed that she asked him twice, "If something happened to me, would you promise to take care of our daughter?" Stephen claimed that the question was strange, but he answered it by promising that he would take care of his daughter if anything happened. The question could have been simply an expression of Rhonda's care and concern, but it could also have meant something more, as if she already felt that her life might be cut short, a premonition of something. Rhonda's question turned out to be the very signal that may have gone unheeded. As time passed, and especially after Stephen Nichols was interviewed, his explanation became less definitive. He changed his version of the incident, claiming that Rhonda's fall was not just an accident, but could have been the result of her internal state. Nichols stated that Rhonda was suffering from depression, that she could have chosen that moment on her own to step off the trail and fall. This new account added confusion to an already conflicting picture of the accident. He claimed that there was a single footprint at the scene that supposedly could be evidence that Rhonda had taken a step toward the cliff, perhaps intentionally. This footprint claim caused the investigation to revisit the version of the accident. In addition, Nichols began to state that upon reaching Rhonda's body after her fall, he noticed that she may have still been breathing. He added that upon seeing her in such a state, he decided to help her. According to him, she was in severe agony and he tried to do what he thought was right in such a situation. This statement he made in the interview raised strong questions. Nichols began referring to Rhonda as a wounded soldier who supposedly had to be finished off because her injuries were too severe to save. And this comparison, not only bizarre but disturbing, became a source of renewed suspicion. Could it be that Nichols didn't just watch Rhonda's fall but was somehow involved in her death? Why would he make such a dangerous statement? This moment in the interview was interpreted as a possible confession to something much more serious. Subsequently, although Stephen claimed that his account in the interview was an attempt to explain the strangeness of the day, his words only served to complicate the picture for investigators. After all, as Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, claimed, her daughter could not have voluntarily passed away. She was on antidepressants and anti-anxiety medication, but there was no indication that she could have been set up for such an act. Julia, certain that her daughter could not have made such a choice, claimed that Nichols was lying. She claimed that he was the one who pushed Rhonda off the cliff and then tried to give investigators the impression that Rhonda's death was an accident. According to Julia, Stephen's behavior was not only strange, but suspicious. Investigators began to wonder what really happened that day. The theory that Rhonda might have decided to walk off the trail on her own was confounded by additional evidence collected at the scene. In addition, Stephen's accounts, which at first seemed plausible, soon began to become increasingly doubtful. He repeatedly changed his explanations, and his original version, in which he referred to Rhonda's fall as an accident, now sounded unconvincing when he himself began talking about footprints and Rhonda possibly still alive. The details revealed in the interview continued to raise questions and uncertainty about the veracity of his claims. Was it a mere coincidence that Rhonda was asking such strange questions about caring for his daughter hours before the fall? What did his words mean that she might still be alive when he got to her body after all? Why did Nichols compare her to a wounded soldier? And what did he mean by the help he supposedly gave Rhonda at that moment? These questions remained unanswered, but they also confirmed that the whole story was far more convoluted than it initially appeared. Rhonda's mother, Julia, was adamantly opposed to the idea that the version of voluntary abandonment or accidental death could be accepted as true. To her, it was absolutely impossible. She was certain that her daughter could not have left in such a way, especially with a small child in her arms. Initially, the case of Rhonda Casto's death was ruled an accident, and the theory that her death was caused by an accidental fall seemed plausible. Stephen Nichols, during the initial interviews and investigation, claimed that Rhonda's fall from a cliff on the popular Eagle Creek Trail was a tragic accident caused by slippery conditions and bad weather. He recounted how he and Rhonda decided to spend the day outdoors, and that the fall occurred when she slipped and was unable to keep her balance on the slippery trail. All of this, he said, was an accident, and their relationship was in a good place at the time. Local authorities, following these allegations, concluded that the tragedy was the fault of natural conditions, and there was not enough evidence to consider Rhonda's death a homicide or a voluntary departure from life. However, over time, and under pressure from new circumstances and repeated statements made by Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, the case was reconsidered. Julia Simmons, Rhonda's mother, remained deeply convinced throughout the investigation that her daughter could not have voluntarily passed away. She maintained that Rhonda was full of life, cared for her daughter, and had no intention of taking her own life. Simmons insisted that her daughter could not have jumped off the cliff as Stephen Nichols had suggested, and that she had been pushed to do so. For several years, Julia continued to insist on her opinion, claiming that Nichols was responsible for Rhonda's death. When, after a time, the investigation resumed again, new evidence and testimony led to the creation of a grand jury to decide whether Stephen Nichols should be indicted. This decision was based on circumstantial evidence that began to emerge after Stephen's initial version of the accident. The key factors that led investigators to reconsider the case were repeated changes in Nichols' story, as well as oddities in his behavior after the accident. One of the most bizarre and disturbing was his claim that Rhonda asked him some unusual questions that day before she fell off the cliff. She asked, in his words, "If something happened to me, would you promise to take care of our daughter?" This statement perplexed investigators, and they began to suspect that Rhonda may have had a premonition of something bad, or perhaps was already in a dangerous situation. In addition, his strange behavior after Rhonda's fall, particularly the claim that she may have still been alive when he reached her body, did not add credence to his stories. As more evidence and facts began to surface, the police decided to conduct a new investigation. This led to the creation of a grand jury to take a closer look at the case and decide if an indictment should be filed. In April 2014, the decision was made to indict Stephen Nichols for murder. That charge was filed as a secret indictment, which investigators said was based on new evidence, testimony, and analysis that could not be fully released to the public. On February 12, 2015, Stephen Nichols was arrested at the San Francisco airport while returning from a trip. His reasons for being at that airport remained unclear, and at the time his arrest was unexpected and shocking to many. He was arrested on charges of the murder of Rhonda Casto, and it soon became clear that he was facing a serious trial. Under the new charges, he faced a sentence of 25 years to life in prison if proven guilty in court. After his arrest, Stephen Nichols was taken into custody and was held in jail for 15 months until his trial began. This time became extremely difficult for him, as he was accused of murdering the woman he once shared his life with. While Stephen and his defense argued that he was innocent, Rhonda's mother continued to insist that Nichols was responsible for her death. She claimed that he pushed her daughter off the cliff, and her voice grew more and more determined and louder, demanding justice for her daughter. Stephen's time in prison was also a time for a new wave of public interest in the case. Many people who had been following the investigation continued to discuss versions of what had happened on the trail, and everyone had their own take on what might have happened. However, each new statement from Nichols, each change in his version of the incident only added to the confusion of this already confusing case. After months of waiting and accusations, the trial against Stephen Nichols began. The prosecution claimed that Stephen Nichols was responsible for the death of his girlfriend, Rhonda Casto, who died in March 29 when they were hiking the Eagle Creek Trail. The trial was a colorful and tense affair that drew attention not only from locals but also from the general public. Investigators and prosecutors argued that despite initial claims of accident and a fall due to a slippery surface, new evidence had been uncovered that pointed to a possible murder. This evidence, including oddities in Stephen's behavior after the incident and his conflicting testimony, became the basis for the charges. During the trial, Nichols' defense insisted that the tragedy was indeed an accident and that all charges against him were unfounded. They argued that Rhonda may have suffered from depression, which may have led to her decision to take her own life. The defense also focused on the fact that no obvious signs of violence were found at the scene, and that Rhonda could have slipped and fallen due to weather condition. However, prosecutors argued that Nichols' actions after the accident, his changes in his story, and his bizarre statements that Rhonda may have still been alive after the fall raised serious doubts about his version of events. In addition, the evidence provided by Rhonda's mother, Julia Simmons, that her daughter could not have committed suicide became an important element in the case. Julia continued to maintain that Stephen Nichols was guilty and that he pushed her daughter off the cliff. An important point in the trial was to focus on Nichols' mental state, his behavior on and after the day of the tragedy, and the strange questions Rhonda asked him before her fall. Rhonda's questions about whether Stephen would take care of his daughter if something happened to her were an additional factor that cast doubt on the sincerity of his accounts. After a thorough investigation, analyzing all the evidence and testimony provided, the judge and jury were forced to make a decision. On September 16, 2016, the Hood River County Court found Stephen Nichols guilty of criminal reckless homicide of Rhonda Casto and coercion. The court found that Nichols' actions, including his changing statements and erratic behavior after the tragedy, were sufficient to convict him of Rhonda's death. Despite the lack of clear physical evidence of violence, investigators and prosecutors were able to argue that Rhonda's version of an accidental fall did not hold up, given all the circumstances. On October 2, 2016, Stephen Nichols was sentenced to 15 months in prison, which he had already spent in custody, and was also sentenced to 3 years of probation with a mandatory behavioral control program and psychological rehabilitation. The court found his actions criminal, although it did not conclude that he directly committed murder with intent. Instead, he was found guilty of criminal reckless homicide, meaning that Rhonda's death was caused by his negligence and inattention rather than an act of premeditated violence. Michelle Colvin was born in 1962 in New York City to a family that adhered to strict traditional values. Her parents, Jewish, were people of high standards, and from childhood Shell was surrounded by a love of knowledge and academic prowess. Books, art, and philosophy were often discussed in the home, which made Shell very focused on her education. She was an intelligent, determined, and confident young woman striving not only for personal success, but also to create strong, stable relationships. After graduating from high school, Sheila entered a prestigious university where she chose to major in economics. During her studies, she demonstrated outstanding abilities and diligence. Soon, Sheila graduated with honors and began building her career. Her professional ambitions rose to the top, and she quickly became one of the leading employees at the investment bank UBS. Her success in the professional sphere was noticeable. She gained the respect of her colleagues and began to move steadily up the career ladder. While her work life was becoming increasingly successful, there was one significant turnaround in Sheila's personal life. Shelley met Rod Colvin in 1998. At the time, Rod was 11 years younger than her, which added contrast to their relationship. Rod was ambitious, confident, and attractive, yet his career was not that successful. He was a man with very unstable sources of income, which contrasted with Shelley's financial success. Their first encounter took place at a Jewish singles meeting organized in New York City. Despite their age difference, they hit it off immediately. Rod attracted Sheila with his charisma and ability to talk about intellectual topics. A few months later, they started dating, and a year later, in 1999, they were married. Rod was not only her husband, but also the man with whom she shared many important moments in her life. Their relationship began as full of love and understanding. Shelley, despite her career ambitions, felt that her relationship with Rod could be harmonious and stable. However, the relationship soon began to change as Shelley continued to achieve success in her career. Rod found himself dependent on her both emotionally and financially. Shelley continued to work in top positions at UBS, while Rod switched to playing backgammon professionally, which did not provide him with a steady income. His backgammon hobby was one of the factors that contributed to the deterioration of their relationship. Rod was passionate about his hobbies, but his financial dependence on Shelley and her constant success at work became a point of tension in their family. Shelley began to feel that she was not only financially responsible for the house, but that her needs and desires were being ignored. Constant quarrels over money and family responsibilities became commonplace. Rod, in turn, showed little support, which only made matters worse. The problems in their marriage worsened after the birth of their children. In 2000s, they had a daughter, Anna, and in 2006, a son, Miles, who was conceived with the help of a donor, since Shelley could no longer have children. However, despite the joys of motherhood, her relationship with Rod became increasingly strained. Soon, Shelley began to experience feelings of loneliness, and she realized that her marital problems with Rodian were not going to go away. Rod continued to cheat on her, and increasingly Shelley made decisions that called into question the future of their union. Sheila began to think about divorce, and her anxiety only increased when she discovered that Rod was hiding his regular romantic liaisons and may no longer have been committed to the family. Then, in 2009, Shelley made a firm decision to begin the divorce process. She planned to exclude Rod from her will because she doubted his sincerity and fidelity. A marriage that once seemed perfect had become a source of fear and anxiety for her. Shelley was also concerned about the safety of her children, which also played a major role in her decision. On December 3, 2009, she set up a meeting with her attorney to discuss changes to her will. But no sooner had she completed the process than tragedy caught up with her. On the morning of December 31, 2009, Shelley was found dead in the bathroom of her apartment. That morning, her 9-year-old daughter Anna discovered her mother's body face down in the water. Police were called to the scene, but there were no obvious signs of violence at the time, and the death was initially ruled an accident. When police arrived on the scene, they caught a fairly ordinary scene for the apartment where the tragedy occurred. Shell Colvin was living alone in the apartment, as her marriage to Rod Colvin was coming to its logical conclusion, to say the least. Shell and Rod were no longer living together. He had left her and moved into a neighboring apartment on the same floor. Although the couple continued to remain in close contact because of their joint children, Shelley's apartment was spacious and bright, furnished in an understated and modern style. There were no obvious signs of chaos or violence in the apartment. The police noticed that it was relatively quiet. Everything was in its place. There were no scattered items or signs of a struggle. All of this suggested that the incident had most likely happened suddenly and without outside interference. The police began searching the apartment and soon found themselves in the bathroom where Shelley's body was found. The woman's body was in a rather strange position. She was lying face down in the bathtub, partially submerged in water. At first glance, the situation resembled drowning. There were no obvious signs of violence on the body, such as bruises or injuries that might indicate a struggle or assault. The water in the bathtub had no strange odor, and the room itself was in order. At first, the police decided that the death could have been an accident. It was likely that Shelley had slipped in the bathtub, lost consciousness, and, unable to get out, drowned. However, despite the lack of external injuries, the police still decided to send the body to the morgue for pathological examination. The initial assumption of an accident seemed logical, but investigators decided not to jump to conclusions and not to rule out possible other versions. The body was taken away for autopsy to confirm or refute the hypothesis that Shelley's death was caused by drowning. In parallel, the police decided to interview Shelley's closest acquaintances and relatives. At the scene, officers began gathering information in an attempt to find out if the woman had any ill-wishers who might have been interested in her death. Among those interviewed was her friend, as well as several relatives, including her sister and older brother, who immediately began voicing their concerns about Shelley's escalating relationship with her husband, Rod Colvin. According to those close to her, Shelley and Rod were in the process of divorcing, and the situation between them was becoming increasingly tense. Rod not only changed his behavior drastically in recent years, but also showed signs of aggression. He began to take it out on Shelley more often, their arguments became more violent, and it was noticed by everyone around them. Shelley, for her part, made no secret of the fact that she planned to divorce her husband and exclude him from her will because she did not trust him. Moreover, she was contemplating a strategy to secure a secure future for herself and the children, as her marriage to Rod had proved destructive and morally exhausting. Interviewees also talked about how often Rod stayed in Shelley's apartment despite their breakup, and that his presence became unpleasant for everyone. He was persistent and aggressive, especially recently. The police began to focus on this information given its connection to the developing conflict in the Colvin household. Rod was married to Shelley, but their relationship had become so cold and strained that further coexistence was impossible. Shelley had already made the decision to file for divorce, and her attorney was preparing to prepare the appropriate documents. On the day of her death, she intended to meet with the lawyer to discuss the next steps in dividing her assets and changing her will. All of these circumstances led police to wonder about Rod's possible involvement in Sheila's death. Police also drew attention to the fact that Rod was on the scene rather quickly. This moment became suspicious to investigators because it could have indicated that Rod had been at the scene earlier. Police began to wonder if he could have been involved in Sheila's death. However, so far there was no reason for strong suspicion on this evidence, as he lived close to Sheila to see the children. During the interview, several of Shelley's friends and acquaintances also said that she often complained about her husband's behavior, his cheating, and the pressure he put on her. With each passing day, the tension in the family increased and the relationship became more conflictual. Shelley, according to her loved ones, was in search of a way out of this situation. She was looking for ways to make her life safe, and her determination to leave Rod and do so in the safest way possible was becoming more and more evident. All of this reinforced the police's suspicions that Shelley may have been victimized by someone she once loved. The police also turned their attention to the inheritance situation. Shelley had left a substantial sum in her will, and it appeared that her planned changes to the will, excluding Rod from being an heir, might have been an important factor in pushing him into crime. After all, Rod, being out of work and dependent on her finances, could have suffered greatly from her decision, and that could have been a strong motive for murder. With all this information in mind, the police decided to wait for the results of the autopsy, which would shed light on the true cause of Sheila's death. It was decided that no definitive conclusions could be drawn until an official report from the pathologists was received. Despite the initial speculation, the investigation continued, and investigators prepared for a deeper analysis of all the facts and possible leads. Immediately after the tragic death of Shelley Colvin on December 31, 2009, the investigation found itself in an uncertain position. The initial assessment of the situation, based on an external examination of the body and the conditions in the apartment, did not indicate a violent death. It looked like an accident. The woman slipped in the bathtub, lost consciousness, and suffocated in the water. The police found no signs of struggle at the scene, and the family, especially the parents and loved ones of the Danishefsky family, due to their religious beliefs, strongly opposed an autopsy. Shelley came from an Orthodox Jewish family, and according to tradition, the body of the deceased should be buried as soon as possible intact. An autopsy that compromised the integrity of the body was seen as an impermissible interment. Such objections were not merely an expression of the personal will of the relatives, but a reflection of a religious commandment deeply rooted in her family's worldview. Therefore, after the discovery of the body, despite the suspicious posture in which Shelley was found in the bathtub, medical intervention was minimized. The cause of death was recorded as undetermined but presumed to be drowning. Thus, no immediate forensic action was taken. This circumstance played a key role in the further development of the case. It enabled the possible perpetrator to avoid immediate attention from the investigation. Over the following months, no one officially considered her death to be the result of intentional exposure. The scene was not isolated as a full-fledged crime scene, and this was another weak link at the very beginning of the case. Even the family, in the first weeks after the tragedy, was inclined to accept the accident version based on superficial circumstances. However, the situation began to change as time passed. Doubts about the official version grew, and the most alarming signals came from Sheil's immediate family. They knew Sheil was preparing to divorce Rod, intended to cut him out of her will, and had already scheduled a meeting with a lawyer for the day after her death. Moreover, there were known instances of aggression on Rod's part in their relationship. All this caused an inner uneasiness that grew stronger by the day. Gradually, the family developed the feeling that Sheila had not died by accident, and it was at this point that they made a difficult decision. A few months after her death, against their previous beliefs and religious principles, the Danishevsky family filed a formal request to exhume the body. The decision was not an easy one. It went against many of the fundamental tenets of their faith. But the desire to establish the truth and get answers to the questions that had plagued them since Sheila's death was stronger. The experts who performed the autopsy were as careful and respectful of the body as possible. However, what they discovered shocked not only the relatives but also the investigator. During the pathology examination, it was determined that Shell's hyoid bone was broken on the right side, an injury that rarely occurs in accidental falls. In addition, there were hematomas and internal hemorrhages in the soft tissues of the neck, especially on the right side, which, according to the forensic medical examiner, indicated exposure prior to the time of death. All of this combined gave reason to conclude Shel Colvin's death was not caused by drowning. The cause of her death was neck compression, i.e. strangulation. In addition, the experts found evidence of petechiae, pinpoint hemorrhages in the eyeballs, which are a characteristic symptom of strangulation. These symptoms are indicative of increased pressure caused by airway compression. Together with the fractured hyoid bone and the hematomas, the picture became more and more convincing. Sheila had been murdered. With these findings, the prosecutor's office had a welcome opportunity to revisit its initial assumptions. The Manhattan District Attorney Matthew Bogdanos issued an official statement making it clear Sheila's death was not an accident but a carefully disguised murder. She didn't drown, it was strangulation. She was strangled, he later told the jury in the courtroom. Despite the medical findings, however, the path to justice proved to be an indirect one. Rod Colvin's defense, led by attorney Robert Gottlieb, vigorously challenged the new charges. They argued that the prosecution's version suffers from many gaps and contradictions. In their view, the injury to the hyoid bone could have been caused by a fall, for example, if Shelley had actually slipped and hit her neck on the edge of the bathtub. Moreover, they recalled that the medical examiner who examined the body at the scene noticed no outward signs of violence. There were no bruises, scratches, or characteristic marks on the neck. Petechiae were also not initially recorded, which, according to the defense, calls into question their reliability as evidence. Attorney Gottlieb also pointed to serious omissions on the part of the police. He emphasized that the investigation was flawed from the start. The scene was not properly sealed off, no prints were taken, and outsiders, including the family's rabbi, were allowed to enter the bathroom and even wipe liquids from the floor. This, he argued, seriously undermined the reliability of all subsequent findings. In addition, the attorney cited possible pressure on the prosecutor's office from the insurance company, which had filed a civil suit attempting to block Colvin's access to payments from his wife's policy. According to Gottlieb, the case gained momentum precisely because of that lawsuit. He suggested that authorities rushed to file charges against Colvin to prevent him from getting the insurance payout. And did so, he said, just weeks before the 6-year deadline after which the case could be considered closed expired. All of this, the lawyer argued, shows the pressure on the prosecutor's office and the lack of proper objectivity in the investigation. So despite the fact that the autopsy provided key evidence supporting a violent death, at this stage Rod Colvin effectively avoided arrest. Investigators and prosecutors continued to gather additional evidence, while Rod himself remained at large. In fact, the first attempt to bring him to justice was unsuccessful. No formal charges were filed. The investigation continued, but now against the backdrop of a fierce debate between the prosecution and the defense, each of which argued that the truth was on their side. Although there was evidence of strangulation, the contradictions in the police actions and the initial interpretation of what had happened greatly complicated the case. Rod Colvin remained off the grid at that point. However, as time would later show, the investigation did not stop. The question of who was actually responsible for Sheila Colvin's death remained open, but at this point in the story, it was clear. This was no longer just a bathroom tragedy. It was the beginning of one of the most convoluted and high-profile criminal cases that would stretch on for years to come. It took more than 6 years from the time of Sheila Colvin's death in 2009 before the investigation finally turned toward her husband, Rod Colvin. He remained at large all these years, despite growing suspicion, increasingly disturbing evidence, and inconsistencies in his behavior. In the eyes of the public, he initially remained the outwardly calm father who had survived the tragedy. But behind the facade, there was a carefully constructed network of manipulations, calculations, and actions that eventually became fatal for Colvin himself. After an autopsy conducted in 2010 at the insistence of Sheila's family found signs of violent death, the case took a new turn. However, there was still not enough direct evidence to bring charges. Rod continued to live his life without being seriously prosecuted by the law. At the same time, he never gave up trying to gain access to the multi-million-dollar fortune left behind by Sheila. These actions became increasingly desperate and even absurd over time, revealing the true depth of his motivation and psychological state. By the time of Sheila's death, she and Rod had 2 children, daughter Anna and son Miles. After their mother's death, custody of the children was temporarily awarded to Rod, but his behavior soon led to a court restricting his rights. In 2011, the children were officially transferred to the care of his parents, David and Carol Colvin, who resided in Scarsdale, New York. Rod found himself effectively cut off from the source of wealth that he had hoped to control through the children, according to the investigation. With no direct access to the trust fund, Rod devised a plan bordering on legal and moral insanity. He concluded that if his daughter Anna married before reaching adulthood, it would change her legal status and open the door for him to control her inheritance. To this end, he allegedly began looking for a teenager who would agree to enter into a sham marriage with her. According to the investigation materials, Colvin offered $10,000 to the young man for participation in this plan. All this came to light thanks to a girl named Deborah Owls, who was in a relationship with Rod at the time. Deborah, being a close friend, witnessed many disturbing details. Her anxiety was heightened when Rod began sharing candid plans with her, recorded on a tape recorder. It was these recordings that later became important evidence in the case. He talked about his idea to marry Anna and thereby circumvent the legal constraints of her being a minor. His logic was that after the sham marriage, he would be able to manage the trust funds in his daughter's name. But as one plan failed, Rod moved to even more desperate steps. He began to see even his own parents as an obstacle. David and Carol, who had taken custody of the children, refused to allow Rod access to the money. According to the prosecution, this is when he had a new idea to eliminate his parents physically. The prosecution claims the plan was inspired by the crime plots of popular television series, in which the main characters resorted to the use of poisons and other methods of eliminating opponents. The investigation found that Rod had researched information about rare toxic substances that the prosecution said he intended to use. He was interested in chemical compounds featured in television shows and feature films, including substances that cause instant unconsciousness and respiratory arrest. He also considered setting a fire in his parents' home or staging an attack under a fictitious reason. The case file states that Rod had purchased a false mustache, a wig, and even special makeup with which he intended to change his appearance to, as he put it, mislead everyone. His plan was to knock on his mother's door, pretending to be a stranger, and stab her in the neck using the martial arts techniques he possessed. However, at the last minute, Rod abandoned the plan, which was later revealed to have been at the insistence of Deborah Owls. She persuaded him to abandon the plan, which may have saved his parents' lives. It was her revelations that later became key to the case, allowing the investigation to move closer to the final stage. Against this backdrop, another startling episode took place. In 2013, when at first glance the case was suspended and Rod was still at large, a text message in the format of a memo was found in one of the family's electronic devices. It purportedly contained a confession on behalf of daughter Anna to her mother's murder. "I lied. My mom and I had an argument. I pushed her. The water started to turn red. I tried to lift her head, but she didn't move anymore," the message read. The text was framed as if it had been written by a child gripped by guilt. However, forensics and further investigation revealed the letter was composed from a different device, and the writing style and context pointed to an adult author. Prosecutor Matthew Bogdanos later stated that the message was created by Rod himself when he realized that the prosecutor's office had reopened an active phase of the investigation. Thus, he tried to mislead the investigation in advance and absolve himself of responsibility by shifting it to the child. In parallel, the investigation continued to analyze Rod's behavior during all the years that had passed since the death of Sheila. Numerous episodes of psychological pressure, cheating, manipulation, and attempts to deprive Sheila of control over her finances were established. The case file says that as early as 2007, he registered a fake email account from which he sought to meet women and order illegal drugs. He visited dating sites under the false name of James Early, and, according to the investigation, on some days he communicated with more than 40 women at the same time. This became part of the overall picture of his lifestyle, in which he depended entirely on his wife for financial support, but also led a double life. Although Sheila tried to keep the family together for the sake of the children, her patience was wearing thin. She knew about his affairs, his attempts to manipulate the children, and his aggressive outbursts. He wasn't just alienating the family, he was destroying it from the inside out. Once, according to witnesses, he even told his son Miles that Sheila was not his real mother, referring to the fact that the child was born with a donor egg. These words came to symbolize his heartless, manipulative nature. Finally, in 2015, when all these fragments from Deborah Owl's notes to the fake confession in the memo came together to form a coherent picture, the investigation felt there was enough evidence. Rod Colvin was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife, Sheila Danishevsky, on a charge of premeditated murder. He was also charged with additional charges related to attempted tampering with evidence, psychological influence on minors, and possible planning violence against other family members. Trial and verdict. Rod Colvin's trial began in early 2019, nearly a decade after the death of his wife, Sheila Danishevsky. The prosecution argued that Colvin killed his wife for purely self-serving reasons. He feared losing access to her multi-million-dollar fortune when he learned that she intended to change her will and exclude him from the list of heirs. According to prosecutors' version, Rod strangled Sheila in her bathtub and then staged the accident by placing her body face down in the water. Prosecutors presented the jury with an extensive array of evidence, from a medical report showing evidence of strangulation to audio recordings made by his ex-girlfriend Deborah Owls showing Colvin discussing his daughter's sham marriage for the sake of gaining control of the inheritance. Also shown were his attempts to falsify evidence, including an allegedly written murder confession on his daughter's behalf, and plans to eliminate his own parents to gain access to money. Defense attorneys argued that the investigation was based on circumstantial evidence and conjecture. They said the injuries on Sheila's body could have been the result of a fall rather than a violent impact, and cited initial police findings that recognized the death as the result of an accident. The defense also emphasized that the scene was not properly recorded and secured, and therefore many details could have been missed. Nevertheless, everything was presented convincingly enough for the jury. The trial lasted several weeks, during which dozens of witnesses were heard, including experts, family members, police officers, and Colvin's former loved ones. After a thorough review of the materials and 2 days of deliberations, the jury reached a verdict. On March 15, 2019, the New York State Supreme Court found Rod Colvin guilty of the second-degree murder of his wife, Sheila Danishevsky. On April 17, 2019, he was sentenced to 25 years in prison without parole. Lindsay May Lee was born on October 3, 1987, in a small town in South Carolina. She was the third child in a family that has always valued hard work and determination. Since childhood, Lindsay showed outstanding abilities in studies and sports. Her favorite classes were math and computer science, as well as physical activity, which later developed into a serious interest in fitness. Lindsay grew up with a clear sense that she wanted to do something meaningful and help others. After successfully completing high school in 2005, Lindsay enrolled at the University of South Carolina, where she chose to major in information technology. Here, her diligence and ability to solve complex problems did not go unnoticed. Lindsay became popular among her teachers and peers, and her academic success allowed her to quickly build a career. Shortly after graduation, she landed a job with the Lexington County Sheriff's Department. Employees of the department spoke of her as a top-notch professional whose integrity and professionalism always came first. Lindsay was one of those people who not only did her job but genuinely cared about what was going on around her. She helped her colleagues, organized events, and was always ready to support someone in a difficult moment. But her life outside of work wasn't always as serene. Although her professional life was on top of her game, her personal life was going through some tough times. In 2012, Lindsay met Jason Lee. Jason, a little older than her, worked in the security industry and repaired locks, which allowed him to connect with Lindsay. Initially, Jason seemed like an interesting and charming man to Lindsay, and they began dating. He seemed caring and attentive, and Lindsay soon became convinced that she had found a man with whom she could build a future. 2 years into their relationship, in 2014, they got married. That year, Lindsay was full of hope and confidence that their life together would be long and happy. However, over time, the relationship began to deteriorate. Jason became increasingly aggressive and discontent, especially when Lindsay began to focus more and more on her career and health. She began to lose weight, becoming more confident, which only irritated Jason. Every day, their relationship became more and more strained, and in 2016, Lindsay began to think about divorce. At that point, their marriage had long been unhappy, and Jason's constant quarrels and threats were becoming more and more frequent. In early 2017, Lindsay officially filed for divorce. The process was complicated and emotionally intense, and Jason couldn't seem to accept that their relationship had come to an end. Lindsay began dating other people and actively exercised, losing over 130 pounds and regaining her confidence. She was determined to start a new life away from her toxic relationship with Jason. On March 14, 2017, Lindsay failed to show up for work at the Lexington County Sheriff's Department, causing concern among her co-workers. Lindsay was a responsible employee, and her absence that day was unexpected. Knowing Lindsay's complicated relationship with her husband and that the divorce was already being finalized, co-workers and friends began trying to reach her. However, despite their best efforts, Lindsay did not return calls and messages. As time passes, concern grows, and one of her co-workers, aware of the dire family situation, decides to check out what has happened. He arrives at her home in West Columbia to conduct a welfare check. This decision turns out to be fatal. While inspecting the house, he discovered Lindsay's body in the bathtub. She was lying in the water, and her death was obvious. When the police arrived on the scene, the situation already seemed unusual and suspicious. Lindsay Lee's home was located in a quiet West Columbia neighborhood that was not known for a high crime rate. However, upon discovering Lindsay's body, it became clear that the incident was of a much darker nature than originally thought. The police immediately began examining the crime scene, trying to gather any possible evidence that might shed light on what had happened. Upon arriving at the scene, police officers noticed that the back door of the house had been broken into. This immediately attracted attention because entry through the front door was entirely possible, and if it was a casual visit, it could have been through the main entrance. However, the marks on the back door indicated that someone had clearly tried to enter the house illegally. The locks were damaged, and the doors themselves looked like someone had tried to pry them open with tools. This immediately suggested a possible burglary. However, the footprints only became stranger and more contradictory from there. The hallway was a mess. On the floor were scattered things, shoes, small items that could not have been randomly scattered in the course of ordinary life. This clutter was uncharacteristic of Lindsay's home, which was always kept in order. It seemed to indicate that someone had broken into the house not just to steal something but for some other purpose. This fact led investigators to think that the motive for the crime was more personal than just theft. As police officers progressed through the house, they reached the bathroom where Lindsay's body was found. She was lying in the tub in a position as if she had been left there after death had been caused by brutal violence. Traces of blood were visible on the bathroom floor, and they shed light on the extent of the violence the victim had faced. Closer to the walls, a large number of marks were visible, indicating that Lindsay may have tried to run away or fight back. She had not simply died from impact or shock, but appeared to have been beaten and otherwise brutalized before being left in the bathtub to die. This fact increased investigators' suspicions that the murder was not random and was linked to deeply personal motives. An equally important find was Lindsay's jacket, discovered in the washing machine. It attracted attention because its presence there seemed unusual. The jacket was damp, which could indicate that someone had tried to wash it, perhaps hoping that the marks left on the jacket would not be discovered. Several footprints were also found inside the car, but they could not yet be identified at the time of the examination. The jacket and its condition led to the idea that the perpetrator was attempting to cover his tracks, perhaps hoping that it would not be possible to determine what had happened. In addition, blue latex gloves were found in the bathroom. This discovery immediately raised questions. Why did the perpetrator use the gloves? It was obvious that it was to avoid leaving fingerprints. This discovery also suggested that the crime was planned and that the killer was trying to conceal his involvement in the incident. The gloves became an important element of the investigation. A whole pattern of violence was evident at the crime scene, in addition to traces of blood. Medical examiners who arrived on the scene noted that the victim had been severely beaten. Visible injuries included numerous bruises on the neck and body, as well as signs of strangulation. Signs of bleeding on the body and wounds associated with mutilation in the throat area, most likely inflicted with a knife, indicated that death was not instantaneous and was the result of prolonged abuse. In addition, there were bloodstains on the bathroom walls and on the floor, which also indicated that the victim had attempted to struggle and defend himself. These bloodstains led to the conclusion that Lindsay had probably fought back against her attacker, which in turn supported the hypothesis of a personal vendetta or family relationship rather than a random crime. An equally important find was a car parked outside Lindsay's home. As police officers surveyed the street, they noticed a car that was parked near her home. It was soon determined that this car belonged to Lindsay Lee, the deceased. This became another place to look for clues or possible items that would open light on the cause of Lindsay's murder. Forensic experts immediately began examining the fingerprints found at the scene. Initial examination revealed that there were no prints on various items in the house, including doorknobs, furniture, and other surfaces that could belong to the victim. At the same time, DNA traces were found on blue gloves and other items that could later lead to the intruder. Based on these initial findings, police began to build several leads. One of them was related to the robbery. The signs of forced entry and the clutter in the house could indicate that the perpetrator had come to steal something. However, the absence of missing items, as well as the careful preparation of the crime, reflected in the use of gloves and attempts to hide traces, cast doubt on this version. The second version, which investigators began to develop, concerned personal motives. Perhaps Jason, whether against the backdrop of divorce, a difficult relationship, and the threat of losing control of Lindsay's life, could have been the impetus for the violence. Police began to suspect that the murder was not random but a planned act of revenge. Signs of violence and a desire to cover up evidence, including gloves and a jacket in the washing machine, only confirmed this theory. After investigators completed their examination of the crime scene and collected the first important pieces of evidence, the investigation focused on one key element: the illegal substances found in Lindsay's car. A small package was discovered in the car. hidden in the glove compartment. This discovery raised certain questions for investigators, as all of Lindsay's acquaintances as well as her colleagues in the Lexington County Sheriff's Department categorically stated that she had never used illegal substances. Lindsay was a strict and organized woman who always took care of her health and appearance, and her friends and colleagues could not believe such information. Nevertheless, the police could not simply ignore this fact. How the illegal substances could have gotten into Lindsay's car remained an open question, and it could have been an important link in the chain of investigation. The investigation decided to scrutinize the find, and DNA samples were taken from the package. When the results came back, they showed that there were traces of DNA on the package that matched those on the blue latex gloves found at the crime scene. This discovery was a major milestone in the investigation, although no one could yet say for sure exactly who the DNA belonged to. The focus of the investigation was now on Jason Lee, Lindsay's ex-husband, who became the prime suspect. The police began collecting information about him, studying his movements, as well as analyzing his behavior on the day of the murder. Jason wasn't the only person who could be connected to the crime, but his skills, as well as several suspicious coincidences, made investigators pay close attention to him. One of the most suspicious facts involved his professional skills. Jason Lee worked in the security industry and was skilled at installing and opening locks, which was an important piece of evidence. On the day of the murder, according to the investigation, Jason could have used his skills to get into Lindsay's house through the back door, having first broken the lock. This theory became increasingly likely, given that the locks on the back door were indeed damaged, indicating the possible use of tools. The investigation quickly determined that Jason knew how to pick locks, and this became an important piece of evidence. After experts determined that the door had been broken into, police began to build a theory about how the crime itself took place. They hypothesized that Jason arrived at Lindsay's home on the evening of March 13, 2017. He likely expected her to be home at a certain time and used his professional expertise to easily open the back door so as not to leave a mark on the front entrance. Investigators also determined that Lindsay was holding a grocery bag at the time of the murder, indicating that she had just returned home. When she entered the house, Jason attacked her. He beat her, took hold of her throat with his hands, squeezing her throat, and used a knife to mutilate the victim's throat before leaving her body in the bathtub to die from blood loss. The investigation also highlighted the oddities surrounding Jason's fitness bracelet. He used the device to track his activity and health, and its data became an important element of the investigation. According to data collected from his Fitbit, there was a strange pause in his activity on the night of March 13, 14. The data showed that there was no activity recorded on his fitness bracelet for several hours when investigators believe a murder may have been committed. This was highly unusual, as such long pauses never occurred on other days. Based on this data, investigators began to suspect that Jason may have spent this time not at his home, but at Lindsay's home, where he committed the crime. Police thoroughly investigated Jason's movements that evening. It was determined that he traveled to West Columbia, where Lindsay's home was located, in his personal automobile. Later, according to witnesses and surveillance footage, he was spotted at a Walmart in the neighboring town of Simpsonville, where he likely stopped after the murder. He parked his car and walked across several parking lots for a short time, which investigators believe may have been an attempt to distance himself from the vehicle he drove to West Columbia. A few minutes later, Jason returned to the same vehicle to park it next to other vehicles, and then continued his actions by making several purchases at Walmart. One of the key points for the investigation was Jason's behavior after the murder. He reported that he woke up at his Simpsonville home and discovered that his vehicle was gone. However, analysis of data from his Fitbit and testimony from other witnesses contradicted what he said. The data showed that he was not at his home that day, but in the neighborhood where the murder occurred. This contradiction caused investigators to focus even more on Jason as the prime suspect. In addition, police needed to take DNA samples from Jason for further comparisons. However, investigators realized that if they started acting too quickly and aggressively, it could make him suspicious, and he might try to escape or destroy evidence. At the time, the police did not have enough direct evidence to make an arrest, and the investigation decided to proceed cautiously to avoid spooking the suspect. This was a risky decision, as each day without new evidence left them with a sense of uncertainty. The investigation continued to gather more evidence to strengthen their case and bring it to a finale. The evidence that pointed to Jason was getting stronger and stronger, but there was still a lot of work to be done before they could prove his guilt. His movements, oddities in his statements, and evidence from the crime scene hinted at his involvement, but they weren't enough to make an arrest. All of this information helped build a theory that Jason Lee may have been involved in the murder of his wife. But in order to complete the investigation and bring him out into the open, the police needed to gather more evidence and obtain DNA samples for final certainty. After the police gathered enough evidence to solidify their suspicions, the decisive moment came. Jason Lee, Lindsay's ex-husband, was brought in for questioning to clarify his involvement in the crime under investigation. His behavior and testimony became an important link in a case that, despite the plethora of evidence, was not yet closed. The police knew they had to approach the case carefully to avoid giving Jason a chance to escape or destroy evidence. But they also realized that this was a chance to get a confession, or at the very least, to create additional grounds for arrest. The moment Jason was called in for questioning, his appearance immediately caught the investigators' attention. There were noticeable scratches on his face that looked like injuries sustained from fingernails. This was an important element for police because experts had previously found traces of tissue, blood, and possibly skin particles from another person under Lindsay's fingernails. This evidence was key, indicating that Lindsay was trying to defend herself against her attacker, and that she may have left marks on his body as she struggled. When investigators asked Jason about the cause of these scratches, he immediately tried to explain them as the effects of an accidental shave. This statement immediately alerted the police. Jason claimed that the scratches on his face were the result of sloppy shaving, but investigators already had information that he had been telling co-workers for several days that he had received the injuries from his cat. This contradiction in his testimony seemed odd, and it became obvious to the police that Jason was hiding the real cause of the injuries. Why had the cat left such scratches on Jason's face? It was unlikely. Too many coincidences and oddities in his stories suggested that he was trying to hide the real cause of these injuries. For investigators, this was an important indicator that Jason might have been involved in his wife's murder. At the same time, experts had already noted that there were signs of a struggle at the crime scene and that Lindsay was likely trying to defend herself by inflicting injuries on her killer. What was particularly disturbing was that Jason began his narrative of what had happened before he was even questioned about the case. When he was invited for questioning, he immediately began to talk about where he had been at the time of the murder, and it all sounded like a prearranged version that he had built up without knowing what questions he would be asked. This seemed unusual and suspicious, as the normal behavior of a murder suspect is to answer questions, not to start a narrative on his own initiative. Jason claimed that he was far away from the scene at the time of Lindsay's murder, and his alibi was supposedly ironclad. However, the investigation already knew that his testimony did not match the facts. Surveillance cameras recorded his presence in the West Columbia area, including in the parking lot where he parked his car and later returned to Walmart in his work vehicle. All of this data showed that Jason could not have been where he claimed to be at the time. In addition, the police already knew that his version of what happened did not match other data. Information about his fitness bracelet showed a strange pause in his activity, which also didn't match his account of allegedly being away from Lindsay's house. This fact further undermined the credibility of his claims. The police were convinced that Jason was lying in every story he told in an attempt to cover up his involvement in the crime. When the police realized that Jason continued to lie despite the many facts pointing to his involvement, the decision was made to arrest him. Investigators knew they couldn't let Jason get away while they had enough evidence to charge him with murder. They didn't want to let the moment pass, and a detention became inevitable. In addition, the police decided that now would be a good time to take DNA samples from Jason to make further comparisons with the samples found at the crime scene. These samples included traces found on the blue latex gloves and in Lindsay's car. Jason's DNA samples became key to the investigation at that point, as they could definitively confirm or deny his involvement in the murder. Jason was arrested and taken to the station where he was charged with murder and other burglary and robbery offenses. During interrogation, already as a suspect, he continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that he did not kill Lindsay. But his answers became increasingly confused and contradictory. After his arrest, Jason was analyzed and his DNA samples were sent to a lab to be compared to samples obtained from the crime scene. These samples were taken from the gloves from which his DNA was extracted, as well as from a bag of illegal substances found in Lindsay's car. The experts quickly compared the data, and the results left no doubt. The DNA on the gloves and the bag of illegal substances was a perfect match to Jason Lee's DNA. This match was decisive for the police. They now possessed irrefutable evidence that Jason was not only at the scene of the crime, but also involved in the murder of his wife. All his attempts to justify himself became empty words, and the investigation had enough grounds to continue the investigation and prepare for the trial. After Jason Lee was arrested and charged with the murder of his wife Lindsay, the case went to trial, which attracted the attention of both the local community and the media. The trial began in June 2019, and for many, it was a long-awaited moment to learn what happened on that fateful day, March 13, 2017, when Lindsay was murdered in her own home. The trial scrutinized every aspect of the crime, from the evidence collected at the scene to the testimony of the parties. The trial began with the opening of the indictment, which charged Jason Lee with the premeditated murder of his wife, as well as first-degree burglary and other offenses. The prosecution presented evidence that Jason broke into Lindsay's home using his professional skills as a locksmith and killed her with extreme cruelty. The motivation was established during the trial: divorce and financial problems, and the threat of losing control of Lindsay's life as she planned to start a new life. Jason's attorneys tried to portray him in a softer light, arguing that his actions were caused by emotional breakdown and stress related to the divorce, and that the murder was not premeditated. However, the evidence presented, including DNA found on gloves and a bag of banned substances in Lindsay's car, refuted this theory. One of the key points of the trial was the comparison of the DNA with samples obtained from the crime scene. The results were undeniable. Jason's DNA was found on several items, including gloves, as well as in the bag of illegal substances found in Lindsay's car. This evidence was crucial to the case and left no doubt about his involvement in the crime. Court transcripts showed that during the trial, Jason Lee did not plead guilty despite compelling evidence and witness testimony. He continued to insist on his innocence, claiming that his DNA may have gotten to the crime scene by accident. His defense tried to challenge the evidence, arguing that the blood and DNA traces could have resulted from other circumstances. However, the judge, considering all the evidence presented, did not accept these arguments. The trial lasted several weeks, and each day of the trial added more and more details to the picture of what had happened. However, during all this time, Jason failed to convince the court of his innocence, and all the charges against him were thoroughly analyzed and proved. In the end, the court came to a consensus. As a result of the court sessions on July 16, 2019, the Lexington County Court found Jason Lee guilty of the premeditated murder of his wife Lindsay Lee, as well as Level 1 burglary. The trial found that Jason Lee took advantage of his professional locksmith skills to enter Lindsay's home, where he attacked her, grabbed her throat with his hands, squeezed it, and used a knife to mutilate the victim's throat, before leaving her body in the bathroom, where she died from blood loss. The judge, after hearing all the evidence and considering the evidence, concluded that the crime was carefully planned. Jason Lee attempted to cover his tracks, including using gloves and planting illegal substances in the victim's car to make the robbery look like a robbery. Despite his attempts to exonerate himself, evidence including DNA evidence, witness statements, and investigative files left him with no way to escape accountability. On July 16, 2019, Jason Lee was sentenced to life in prison without parole. The court also noted that the defendant showed no remorse for his guilt, and continued to insist on his innocence despite clear evidence. This was a decisive decision for everyone involved in the trial, as it meant that the murderer was punished to the full extent of the law. The Christmas season of 1961 was, as it always is in Newfoundland, harsh, frosty, with piercing winds and snowdrifts plunging the streets of small towns into white silence. In one of the families in these parts, January 28, 1961, a girl was born, who was named Shirley Jane Turner. Her parents were simple people, without high wealth, but with a firm character. Her father made his living in the fishing industry. Like many in the area, he was also a former U.S. serviceman, and her mother took care of the home and the children. Shirley grew up determined and ambitious. Already in early childhood, she showed a difficult character. She easily went to the conflict, defending her point of view, was often stubborn and irascible. At school, she showed good results but had few friends. Her persistence and tendency to dominance sometimes repelled others. It was difficult to change her mind. She never admitted to mistakes, and if something did not go according to her plan, became aggressive. Nevertheless, her persistence paid off. She enrolled at Memorial University of Newfoundland, choosing to study medicine. Shirley dreamed of a career as a doctor, longing for the recognition and respect she felt she deserved. But along with this, a sense of superiority grew in her. She did not tolerate criticism, and always thought that she knew better how things should be. Her personal life was more complicated. She had relationships over the years growing up, but many didn't stand up to her character. She married twice, but both marriages ended in divorce. From these unions, she was left with 3 children, but gradually they began to spend more time with their fathers or other relatives. Shirley herself decided that family was not her calling and focused on her career, becoming a fully independent woman. By the end of the 90s, Turner was already a certified doctor, worked in various medical institutions, and continued to move up the career ladder. She seemed strong, determined, but her character made her a loner. It was during this period that she met the man who seemed like he could change her life. A young doctor named Andrew Bugbee. Andrew David Bugbee was born on September 21, 1973, to David and Kate Bugbee. Unlike Shirley, his childhood was filled with warmth and care. He grew up in sunny California, where he was surrounded by loving family and friends. From an early age, he showed friendliness, responsiveness, and desire to help people. Andrew easily found a common language with others, able to listen and support. At school, he was a favorite of teachers and friends, the very person on whom you can rely. His dream of medicine appeared in childhood, and he confidently went to its realization. After graduating from high school, he entered medical school, then did his residency in Pennsylvania. His friends and colleagues admired his kindness and sense of humor. He was someone who was always there to help, whether it was patients, friends, or casual acquaintances. By the early 2000s, his career was gaining momentum. He was a promising doctor, and a future full of opportunity lay ahead of him. But that's when Shirley Turner came into his life. Andrew and Shirley met in a medical environment when they both worked in a hospital. What initially brought them together was their shared passion for medicine, talking about work and research. Despite the age difference, Shirley was 13 years older than Andrew. A romantic relationship developed between them. This union looked strange to others. Andrew, a young, kind, energetic man surrounded by friends, and Shirley, demanding, irascible, prone to manipulation. Their relationship was not peaceful from the beginning. Shirley possessed possessive tendencies. She was jealous of Andrew's friends, his co-workers, even his parents. She demanded accountability for every move, constantly making a scene if things didn't go her way. Andrew, being a soft person, tried to avoid conflicts, but gradually began to change, became less open, more tense. Friends noticed that something was going wrong but could not intervene. Every time the relationship reached an impasse, Shirley manipulated the situation so that Andrew stayed with her. But in the fall of 2001, he finally made a decision. He could no longer tolerate her tantrums, controlling behavior, and constant accusations. In early November, He told her he was breaking up. November 5, 2001 was a cold and stressful night for Andrew. He had been working at the hospital all day and had to meet with Shirley in the evening. She insisted on talking, saying they needed to discuss things one last time. He agreed, but his coworkers noticed he didn't seem convinced. "I just want her to realize it's over," he told one friend before leaving. That night, Andrew didn't come home. His phone wasn't answering. No one knew where he was. At first, friends and colleagues did not panic. It's not much. Perhaps he decided to take a break, to spend the evening alone. But with each passing hour, the anxiety grew. The next morning, November 6, passers-by walking in a parking lot near a lake in Pennsylvania noticed something strange. On the pavement, among the fallen leaves, a man lay motionless. Frightened people immediately called the police and an ambulance. Within minutes, officers from the local police department arrived on the scene. EMTs quickly confirmed what was already obvious. The man was dead. Police officers began a search of the area. The man was found in an unnatural pose, his body slightly turned as if he had tried to get up or move at the last moment. There were traces of blood on his clothes and around his body, and several dark stains on the pavement suggested that death had occurred here. The first major discovery was the bullet marks. Upon examining the body, the officers noticed several small lacerations in the chest and face area. This was not an accident, there was a murder in front of them. Medical examiners on the scene confirmed the death and reported several gunshot wounds. No weapon was found nearby, which ruled out the suicide version. Now the first task for the police was to identify the deceased. In the pockets of the man's clothes were found keys, phone, and wallet. Inside the wallet were a driver's license, medical records, and several bank cards. According to the documents, Andrew David Bugbee, a 28-year-old physician who worked at a local hospital, was lying in front of the officers. To confirm his identity, officers contacted the hospital where Bugbee worked. Several of his co-workers expressed shock and immediately confirmed that he had indeed failed to show up for his shift. The next step was to notify his family. Bugbee's parents, who lived in the U.S., received the terrible news from police officers. Their son had been found dead. Now the investigation had a name for the victim: ballistics forensics, the weapon of crime. Initial autopsy and forensic results showed that Bugbee had been killed by several shots at point-blank range. To find out more details, the police called in ballistics experts. A few days later, the ballistics experts provided a report that shed light on the details of the crime. It was determined that the murder was committed with a .22 caliber handgun. The shots were fired at close range, indicating a personal motive. A total of 5 shots were fired to the chest, face, neck, and head. This manner of killing spoke of a violent personal motivation. This was not a random shootout or robbery. The perpetrator had purposefully ensured that Bugbee would not survive. Now the police needed to figure out who might have wanted him dead. As officers began interviewing Bugbee's co-workers and friends, Shirley Turner's name began to appear all too often. One by one, his acquaintances revealed that their relationship with Shirley was strained, full of arguments, jealousy, and manipulation. Doctors who worked with Bugbee said he wanted to break up with her, but she was unwilling to accept it. Some recalled that she was emotionally unstable, prone to outbursts of anger. Bugbee's parents also confirmed that their son was afraid of Turner and tried to end his relationship with her. Police realized Shirley Turner was the prime suspect. Their job now was to locate her at the time of the murder and see if she could have purchased or possessed a .22 caliber weapon. After Shirley Turner's name began to come up in every conversation with Bugbee's co-workers and acquaintances, police began searching for her. The first task was to determine where she was on the day of the murder and what she had been doing in recent weeks. Investigators made a request to check her recent movements, including travel information, transportation tickets, surveillance footage, and any signs of activity that could help reconstruct her itinerary. It was obvious that she had been under a great deal of emotional stress since her breakup with Bugbee, but the question remained: where had she gone since their last meeting? At the same time, her phone records were being checked. The police analyzed incoming and outgoing calls, especially in the days leading up to the murder. Was there an attempt to contact the victim? If so, with what motive? Also of interest were her conversations with other people. Perhaps she shared her thoughts or mentioned plans to someone. In addition, the investigators began to examine her financial transactions, withdrawals, purchases in stores, possible purchases that could shed light on her intentions. Expenses in the final days before the murder were particularly scrutinized. At first glance, the police had ample reason to view Shirley Turner as the prime suspect. Her relationship with Bugbee had been strained, the breakup had been accompanied by emotional outbursts, and their last meeting had taken place shortly before the murder. For now, however, this was only circumstantial evidence. Investigators had more evidence to find. The key was to establish her whereabouts at the time of the crime. At the moment, the police did not know where she was or what she had been doing since her last conversation with Bugbee. This required a thorough analysis of her movements, phone calls, and financial transactions. Realizing that with each passing day the chance of finding important clues was diminishing, investigators began to work faster. They needed to gather enough evidence to make formal charges and take the next step. But most importantly, they had to keep an eye on the suspect before she disappeared for good. The first thing the police noticed was the victim's phone calls. The day before the murder, November 4, 2001, Andrew had several conversations with Shirley Turner. It was clear from the call records that he did not initiate these conversations. On the contrary, it was Turner who persistently called him, and at some point he answered. Their conversation lasted a few minutes and was followed a short time later by another, longer one. After reviewing testimony from Bugbee's co-workers and friends, police were able to surmise that the conversation was not a pleasant one. Most likely Shirley was pressuring Andrew, trying to convince him to meet with her one last time. He hesitated, but eventually agreed, perhaps to put a definitive end to their relationship. It was now up to the police to establish where Shirley Turner herself was at that moment. It was known that she lived in Iowa, but her phone activity and travel records told a different story. It turned out that on November 4, she had traveled several hundred miles, leaving Iowa and heading to Pennsylvania. The journey looked strange, but it became even more suspicious when investigators discovered that she had stopped in another state along the way. That fact didn't seem important at first, but after a police check it became clear that detour in her itinerary was no accident. It was there that she picked up a firearm. She had purchased a .22 caliber handgun shortly before. Paperwork confirmed that she legally owned the firearm, and after the purchase she signed up for firearms training. Her shooting instructor said Turner showed an interest in practicing accurate hits and regularly visiting the range. However, there was something unusual about her behavior. She wasn't just learning to shoot. Her training was intense, focused, as if she was preparing for something specific. But the most curious thing happened on the eve of the murder. The instructor told police that on Non-3, the day before Bugbee's last call, Shirley came to the range but looked worried. She said her gun was missing. At the time, no one paid much attention to it. Little did they know perhaps it was really lost. But now this information looked very different. Investigators began to suspect that this statement was made deliberately to prepare an alibi in advance in case the gun was found after the murder. Further analysis of the data confirmed that on November 4, after Shirley contacted Andrew, she was indeed in Pennsylvania. And then another important piece of evidence surfaced. Eyewitnesses near the parking lot near the lake where Bugbee's body was later found said they saw two cars that evening, a Toyota Corolla and a Toyota RAV4. This was particularly significant because the former belonged to Andrew Bugbee and the latter to Shirley Turner. This became one of the strongest pieces of circumstantial evidence. If Turner's car was there, then she was also at the crime scene. Now the police realized that the version of her involvement in the murder was becoming more and more obvious. But before formal charges could be brought, investigators had to determine what had happened to Shirley after the murder. This was critical, because if they could prove that she had left the country in a hurry, it would look like an attempt to escape justice. They soon found the answer. On November 12, 2001, just days after the murder, Turner left the United States. She flew out of the airport in Toronto and then headed to St. John's, a small town in the Canadian province of Newfoundland and Labrador. That's where she settled. She may not have had a clear plan, but one thing was clear: she wanted to get as far away from the crime scene as possible. While the police were working on her movements, another department was looking at her correspondence and personal records. It was then that investigators made an unexpected discovery. Shirley was pregnant. Her emails to Bugbee were about the baby, about being there for him, about taking responsibility. In one message, she practically begged him to change his mind. But Bagby's friends and co-workers said he doubted the sincerity of those words. He didn't believe a child would make a difference and felt Turner was using this as a way to keep him. Later, while searching her belongings, the police found ultrasound scans that finally confirmed Shirley Turner's pregnancy. This discovery added even more complications to the case. Now, in addition to the legal intricacies of her move to Canada, there was another factor. She was carrying the victim's child. Now, investigators faced a real problem. They were sure that Turner was guilty, but it was no longer possible to arrest her on U.S. soil. They had to start the extradition process, which meant months of legal battles. The police realized that time was playing against them. If Shirley could find good lawyers in time, if the Canadian system decided not to extradite her to U.S. authorities, the investigation could reach a dead end. But what worried investigators most was that Turner could disappear even further. She had already left the country, and there was no guarantee she wouldn't move again. Her pregnancy could have been a shield of sorts for her, a defense against prosecution, and police had to act quickly before it was too late. After police located Shirley Turner in Canada, a complicated extradition process began. U.S. authorities charged her with first-degree murder and sent a formal request to the Canadian government. Canadian law enforcement authorities, after reviewing the evidence received, decided to arrest her. On December 12, 2001, Shirley Turner was arrested in St. John's, Newfoundland and Labrador. For investigators, this marked the first big step toward justice. The joy, however, was premature. It soon became clear that the case would be more complicated than first imagined. After his arrest, the judge hearing the case made an unexpected ruling. Despite the murder charges, he declared that Turner was not a threat to society. This conclusion was based on the fact that the crime was personal and not a threat to the general public. The Canadian court system at the time worked in such a way that suspects who did not pose a threat were often allowed to remain at large until their case was heard. That's what happened to Shirley. Shortly after her arrest, the court approved her release on a bail of 75,000 Canadian dollars. However, her freedom was limited. The court ordered Shirley Turner to surrender her passport to eliminate the possibility of fleeing abroad. She was also prohibited from leaving Newfoundland and Labrador without special permission from the court. In addition, she was required to report regularly to the police station for marking, to be supervised, and to comply with court-ordered conditions. In addition, she was strictly prohibited from purchasing or possessing firearms to minimize the potential danger to others. Despite all these restrictions, the main thing remained the same. Turner was free, and the extradition process was turning into a real legal battle. The news of Turner's pregnancy soon became a central factor that changed the entire defense strategy. While the U.S. side was preparing documents for her extradition, a very different legal story began in Canada. The case was no longer just about murder. It was now about custody of a child who had not yet been born. The Canadian court system was faced with an issue that complicated matters. If Turner was extradited to the U.S., her child would either be born in prison or left motherless. The judges could not ignore this fact, and it began to influence their decisions. Meanwhile, Andrew Bugbee's parents, David and Kate Bugbee, were shocked by what was happening. They learned that their daughter-in-law was pregnant, and despite their grief, they made a firm decision: they must fight for custody of the child. Shortly after Turner's arrest, they moved to Canada to be closer to the events and to follow the trial. They were to face enormous legal challenges. The laws in Canada that protected the rights of the mother made the situation extremely difficult. Despite the allegations against Turner, her pregnancy gave her a huge advantage in court. David and Kate Bugbee were convinced that their grandson deserved a normal childhood, not a life alongside a woman accused of murdering his father. But the system didn't work that easily. On July 18, 2002, Zachary Turner, Andrew Bugbee's son, was born in a St. John's hospital. That moment changed everything. With the birth of the child, the case took an even more confusing turn. Where before it was about Turner's potential extradition, now it became much more complicated. The judges realized that if they agreed to extradition, the infant would either be left motherless or forced to move to the United States. This called into question the very possibility of extraditing Shirley to the American authorities. Shirley Turner felt it. If her position had been precarious before, now she felt much more secure. The system no longer viewed her simply as an accused murderer. She was now the mother of a baby, and that gave her a huge advantage. She realized that with the baby in her arms, she could avoid extradition. Her main strategy now was to present herself not as a woman who had killed her former lover, but as a caring mother who wanted to be unjustly separated from her son. At the same time, Bugbee's parents did not give up. They continued to seek custody of Zachary, arguing that a mother accused of murdering his father could not provide the child with a safe childhood. However, the courts continued to hesitate. For Shirley, on the other hand, life began to fall into place. Despite public pressure, she began to feel stable. She knew that the likelihood of her extradition with the baby was greatly reduced, and she made the most of it. Now that she had her son in her arms, she began to act confidently, creating the image of a good mother. She even started applying for financial aid, saying in interviews that she just wanted to live a quiet life and raise her son. But for David and Kate Bugbee, this situation was more than just a legal battle. It was a fight for the fate of their grandson. They realized that if the courts continued to protect Turner, the child would remain in the hands of the woman they believed was his father's killer. With each passing day, the situation grew more complicated. What started out as a murder charge turned into a long and complicated custody battle. U.S. police and prosecutors continued to insist that Shirley Turner should be extradited to the U.S., but the Canadian court system was increasingly inclined to keep her in the country. The birth of the baby changed everything. Judges now had to consider not only the evidence of murder, but also the welfare of the infant. And that factor tipped the scales more and more in Turner's favor. As the lawyers struggled in the courts, Shirley continued to play her game. She realized that time was working for her. The longer she stayed in Canada, the harder it was for the American side to get her extradited. For Bugbee's parents, it was a nightmare. After Zachary Turner was born, his fate became the subject of a bitter legal battle. Andrew Bugbee's parents, David and Kate, realized that leaving the child with Shirley was not only morally wrong, but dangerous. They began an active custody battle, asking the court to recognize them as the boy's primary caregivers. The first months after the birth of the child showed that Zachary felt more comfortable in the company of grandparents than with his mother. Eyewitnesses who observed their interaction noted that the boy reacted more calmly to the presence of David and Kate, was more willing to spend time with them, and even began to cry when he was handed over to his mother. Shirley, despite her legal victory, showed little concern for the child. It seemed that to her he was more a tool for her extradition defense than an object of maternal love. Many acquaintances of the family noticed that she often left the boy in the care of others, neglected him, and generally did not appear to be a caring mother. Tension between Turner and Bugbee's parents continued to build. At one point, the situation went so far that she even fired her family lawyer when she learned that he was expressing sympathy for David and Kate. She no longer trusted anyone. Despite the legal confusion, Shirley Turner's extradition to the United States remained possible. In November 2002, she was again imprisoned pending a decision by Canada's federal justice minister. The ministry had to determine whether to extradite her to U.S. authorities. David and Kate Bugbee hoped this would be the end of an agonizing story. They believed that justice would finally be served and Shirley would be forced to stand trial for the murder of their son. But that hope quickly crumbled. In January 2003, the court made an unexpected and shocking decision. Shirley Turner was released again. The judge ruled that her crime was not a threat to the community. and that the murder of Andrew Bugbee was a personal tragedy, not a public danger. Turner was now officially presumed innocent. She was once again free to live in Canada, which meant her chances of avoiding extradition became even better. On August 18, 2003, Zachary remained in the custody of his mother. Despite David and Kate Bugbee's best efforts, the court did not give them the right to care for the child, and he remained with the woman they believed to be their son's killer. That day, no one could have predicted what would happen next. Turner was in her home in St. John's when she made a terrible decision. She spiked the baby's food with lorazepam, a powerful sedative that causes drowsiness and mental depression. As Zachary ate, the drug began to take effect. The child became increasingly lethargic and gradually fell asleep. Shortly thereafter, Shirley herself took a lethal dose of the same drug. She was not going to leave any chance for herself or her son. When Zachary was completely unconscious, Turner put warm clothes on him, then tied him to her chest with a sweater so that he could not get free. She then left the house, headed for the fishing pier, and jumped into the Atlantic Ocean. Shirley and Zachary's bodies were found breathless on shore the same day. Sea currents carried them to land where they were discovered by passers-by. Rescuers were called immediately, but it was too late. The child and his mother were dead. Melissa Swiatek was born in 1985 in Indiana. Her childhood was spent in an ordinary working-class neighborhood where life flowed, measured, but not without difficulties. The girl early learned independence. Her parents worked a lot, and most of the time she spent with her grandmother. Being cheerful and sociable, Melissa easily found a common language with others. Clarence Justice, Melissa's age, was born in a neighboring town. He grew up in a large family of 5 children. His father worked as a mechanic, and his mother worked part-time at a local cafe. In his youth, Clarence was not distinguished by special ambitions, but he was always a friendly person with a good sense of humor. They met Melissa in the early 2000s when they both worked at a local supermarket. Their relationship developed rapidly. Within a year, they started living together and then got married. In time, the couple had 3 children. The eldest son was born in 2004, the second child in 2006. The third, in 2007, was born Jada, a little girl with curly brown hair and a smile that could melt any heart. The parents did not care about their children, but domestic difficulties and financial problems gradually made themselves felt. Despite the warm feelings, the marriage of Melissa and Clarence did not stand the test. They often quarreled over money and childcare. Clarence wanted Melissa to spend more time at home, but she dreamed of building a career and not being tied to the household. As a result, the couple separated in 2008, and the children stayed with their mother. After the divorce, Melissa found herself in a difficult situation. 3 young children, lack of money, looking for a stable job. In this difficult period, her cousin Angelica Armstrong came to her aid. She offered to temporarily take her youngest daughter, Jada, to make life easier for Melissa when she needed to leave the city or to do important things. Her sister assured her that the girl would be fine, and Melissa agreed. That's how Jada ended up at the home of Angelica and her boyfriend Timothy Kachekik in Portage, Indiana. They were young people in their early 20s, leading ordinary lives and not standing out in any way. At first glance, they had a home and were willing to take care of the girl. June 16, 2009, a Tuesday, was overcast and rainy. The smell of wet asphalt was in the air. The puddles on the roads reflected the gray sky. In the morning, Angelica Armstrong went about her daily business as usual while Timothy was at home. In the afternoon, Angelica decided to go to the store. She needed to buy milk and a few other small things. She put 2-year-old Jada in the car, fastened her seatbelt, and drove to the nearest store. The store was nearby, only 5 minutes away. As Angelica parked outside the supermarket, the rain intensified. Not wanting to carry the baby in the downpour, she made the decision to leave her in the car. "I'll be quick," she thought, "literally just for a minute," especially since the baby was already starting to fall asleep sitting quietly in the car seat. Angelica ran out of the car, closed the door, and hurried inside. The store was almost empty, shoppers hurrying to finish their business and go home. She grabbed some milk, some fruit, and headed to the cash register. After paying for her purchases, she went outside, covering herself with her hood from the rain. But as she walked to her car, her heart clenched. Jada was gone. Angelika stood frozen for a few seconds, as if she couldn't believe her eyes. She tossed her purchases on the seat and began to look around frantically. The car was locked, the windows unbroken. She looked under the seats even though she knew perfectly well that it was pointless. The girl was nowhere to be found. With trembling hands, Angelika dialed 911. Her heart pounded, her breathing hitched, and her fingers shook so badly that she barely hit the right buttons. The operator's clear, calm voice came through the phone, but the words struggled to escape her lips. She tried to gather her thoughts, but panic came in waves. Her voice shook, her words were confused, but the point was clear. Her 2-year-old daughter was missing. Within minutes, the police arrived on the scene. The rain did not stop. Gray clouds hung over the city, giving everything even more ominous shade. Meanwhile, the rumor of the little girl's disappearance spread quickly down the street. Strangers who heard about the incident stopped nearby, trying to do something to help. The police immediately sprang into action. They interviewed witnesses, checked the nearby streets, and studied the surveillance footage. Angelika stood next to the car, her hands clenched tightly into fists. Her hair was wet from the rain, but she didn't notice it. One question pounded in her head: where was Jada? Within minutes of the 911 call, the first police officers arrived in the store's parking lot. Sirens cut through the sound of the rain, and flashing beacons reflected in the wet asphalt. 2 officers got out of their cars and walked briskly toward Angelika Armstrong, who stood by her car looking confused and nervous. The examination of the scene began immediately. The police scrutinized the car. The doors were closed, the windows were intact, there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. It seemed as if the child had simply disappeared into nowhere. The problem was that there were no eyewitnesses to the abduction. The weather had played its part. The rain had forced people to hurry their shopping and hide under store awnings. By the time Angelika noticed the girl's disappearance, there were only a few store employees and a few shoppers who had just arrived at the scene and witnessed the police work itself. No one had seen anyone kidnap the child. Realizing that time was of the essence, the officers called in the cinematologists with sniffer dogs. The hope was that even though it was raining, the dogs would be able to pick up the trail. While the patrolmen interviewed possible witnesses, an officer escorted Angelika to a police car for a more detailed interrogation. The officers initially wrote off Angelika's anxiety and nervousness as stress, but as the interview progressed, they began to notice that her behavior went beyond the usual shock. She responded confusedly, frequently interrupted, raised her voice, and at one point even became aggressive. When asked how long she had been in the store, she first said 2 minutes, then corrected herself, maybe 5. When the police clarified whether she was sure that the girl was really in the car when she went shopping, the woman hesitated. She hesitated for a few seconds and then answered with obvious irritation, raising her voice sharply. However, there was uncertainty in her tone and her gaze darted from side to side. The policemen noticed this behavior but did not say anything, only glanced among themselves. When it was suggested that she go to the station for a more detailed conversation, the woman suddenly became angry. Her face turned red, her movements became abrupt, and her voice broke into a shout. She indignantly declared that this was a waste of time because instead of asking her questions, the police should be searching for the child. Her emotionality could be attributed to stress, but officers noted that the behavior did not exactly fit the typical reaction of a worried caregiver. The officers calmly but persistently explained that it was important to get as accurate a statement as possible in order to expedite the investigation. Seeing that resistance was only making the situation worse, the woman reluctantly agreed to drive to the station. Even on the road, however, she continued to behave nervously, occasionally rubbing her hands together and looking out the window with obvious concern. At the station, the woman's behavior continued to raise questions for the officers. She would freeze, staring at one point, then begin tapping her fingers irritably on the table, and then suddenly burst into violent emotion, accusing the police of inaction. When the decision was made to test for illegal substances, the results were unexpected. Psychotropic substances were found in Angelika's system. This explained her extreme mood swings and erratic behavior. Taking into account that the woman was under the influence of prohibited substances at the moment when she took a small child with her, it was decided to detain her. Initially, she was charged with negligence, leaving a child in dangerous conditions. In the evening of the same day the police officially announced Angelika's detention. The press quickly picked up the news, and local TV channels were already carrying the first reports on the mysterious disappearance of the 2-year-old girl. While the police were looking into the circumstances of the incident, Jedah's relatives wasted no time. One of the girl's uncles was the first to appeal to the public to help in the search. He appealed to the local media to help in the search for the missing girl. His voice was shaking, and desperation was red in his eyes. He emphasized that every minute counted and urged anyone who knew anything to inform the police immediately. Over the next few days, hundreds of flyers were printed with Jedah's image on them. They were posted around the city, distributed to stores, gas stations, and bus stops. Volunteers spread information on social networks, trying to attract the attention of as many people as possible. Local residents responded. Dozens of volunteers agreed to join the search, searching the neighborhood and forest belts. Cynologists with dogs combed the nearby areas, in the hope of finding at least a trace of the girl. Meanwhile, Jedah's mother, Melissa Swiatek, was not immediately aware of the incident. She was out of town with her new young man at the time. She rarely contacted her relatives as her relationship with them had been strained lately. When she learned of the incident, she immediately returned to the city. But this fact raised questions for the police. Why was the mother out of contact for such an important time? The situation was getting more and more confusing. Each new fact that surfaced during the investigation only complicated the picture. Despite all efforts, the search in the first few days yielded no results. The dogs were unable to pick up a sure trail, probably because of the rain. The surveillance cameras outside the store did not record any suspicious movements near the car. No one in the neighborhood saw anyone dragging or carrying the child away. The only lead the police were hoping for was Angelika Armstrong. If she was telling the truth and really had nothing to do with the girl's disappearance, then Jedah had been kidnapped by someone else. If she was lying, they had to find out why. The case promised to be complicated. It was unclear whether they were dealing with a kidnapping, an accident, or something much more disturbing. One thing remained the same. They had to find Jedah as soon as possible. Hours after Jedah Justice's disappearance, the first major twist in the investigation came. Cynologists with service dogs completed their work at the scene, and their conclusion was unexpected. The experts declared confidently there was no odor of the girl in the car. This meant that the child was not in the car at the moment Angelika Armstrong left it in the parking lot. The police responded to this information with special attention. If Jedah was not in the car, it means that she disappeared not here but somewhere else. So, Angelika's story wasn't true. But for the time being, the detectives did not rush to conclusions, preferring to check all the versions. They decided to continue interrogating the suspect without informing her about the conclusion of the cinematologists. They were interested in who the girl was in contact with during the day, where and in whose company she was. Under the pressure of questions, Angelika mentioned one name, Tim Kachik. The police officers immediately went to the address provided. Tim's house was in the suburbs, in a remote neighborhood outside the city limits. It was an ordinary private house that did not stand out from the others. It looked dilapidated from the outside, but it did not arouse much suspicion. When the police went inside, however, they were confronted with a picture of utter chaos. There were overturned chairs, scattered clothes, dirty dishes, bags, scraps of papers, and old newspapers on the tables. The air was musty, smelling of a mixture of damp, sweat, and something chemical. Inspecting the rooms, the detectives discovered several disturbing details. In one corner of the living room were empty bottles, torn bags, and syringes, hinting at the frequent use of illegal substances. The bedroom was similarly unkempt. The sheets hadn't been changed for a long time, and there were traces of dirt and dust everywhere. But the strangest place was the bathroom. At first glance, it was no different from the rest of the room, but one detail immediately attracted the attention of the investigators. The bathtub was poured concrete. This fact seemed extremely suspicious. Why would someone want to fill the bathtub with cement? This does not seem like a standard repair, especially in a house that was clearly in disrepair. Police officers recorded the find and decided to conduct an on-site examination. While the investigation team was examining the house, the officers also found Tim himself. He was in one of the rooms, half undressed, in a semi-fainting state. He appeared to be under the influence of a highly addictive substance. His appearance was alarming to the police. He looked emaciated, his skin had a sickly tint, his eyes were sunken, and his face was covered with recent burns. One side of his face looked charred, the skin in those areas was rough and scarred. It gave him a frightening expression. He answered questions with difficulty, often confused, lost in thought. The officers tried to find out when he had last seen Jada, but his answers were incoherent, confused. He would say he had seen her in the morning, then claim he didn't know what child he was talking about at all. This behavior left the police in no doubt that he should be detained. They had already found illegal substances in the house, and the concrete tub raised too many questions. In addition, he was clearly intoxicated through the use of illegal substances, which made his behavior even more suspicious. Tim was taken into custody, and his home was declared the site of a detailed investigation. Experts were to chemically analyze the concrete and see if there was anything important underneath. Events began to develop in a new direction. If earlier the main attention was focused on the version of the abduction from the parking lot, now there was a possibility that the disappearance occurred long before that moment. Now the police had to find out what role Tkachuk had played in this, how he was connected to Jada, and why his house was in such a state. The search for the girl continued, but the situation was becoming more alarming by the hour. Following Tim Tkachuk's arrest, the police continued an in-depth investigation into his identity and activities. As they examined his connections and financial transactions, new details emerged that shocked even seasoned investigators. It turned out that he was not only a man with a criminal record, but also an active distributor of illegal substances. Moreover, from the collected evidence, it became clear that he used physical force against little Jada Justice. These facts changed the course of the case. Now it was not only kidnapping but also child abuse. The prosecutor's office quickly issued a preliminary charge that included possible murder. Given the nature of the crime, he faced the death penalty if proven guilty. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Tkachuk was faced with a difficult choice: either remain silent and risk capital punishment, or make a deal with the investigation. After several days of deliberation, pressured by irrefutable evidence, he decided to cooperate. The confession Tkachuk gave was not just shocking, it revealed a cruel, agonizing picture of the last days of the 2-year-old girl's life. According to him, it all started with constant abuse from Anglika Armstrong. The woman often snapped at Jada, hitting her, yelling, treating her as if she were a burden. Tim did not deny that he himself was also involved in the abuse of the child, but emphasized that it was his cohabitant who played a key role in the beatings. On one day, when the girl was particularly restless, Anglika used force on her to such an extent that she lost consciousness. Realizing that something terrible had happened, Armstrong and Tkachuk panicked. They tried to bring the girl to her senses using artificial respiration, but all was in vain. At this point, they realized that the child was dead. As they looked at each other, they realized that they were in a desperate situation. Calling the police meant an immediate charge of murder. There was nowhere to run. They decided to dispose of the body, hoping to cover up the crime. Weaver admitted that the original plan was to burn the body. He wrapped Jada in a blanket, put her in a bag, and drove her to the woods near the city. He took a flammable liquid with him and poured it over the child's remains. However, his plan did not include one thing. The chemical reaction was stronger than he had hoped. The arson was followed by a massive explosion. The flames flared too quickly. Tkachuk did not have time to move to a safe distance. His face was exposed to the heat, so he received burns that later disfigured his appearance. The fire was chaotic and failed to completely destroy the body. In panic, Kachik returned home not knowing what to do next. After a failed attempt to destroy the evidence in the woods, when the fire resulted in an explosion and serious burns, Kachik realized the plan had failed. He returned home and told Angelica all about it. Now they faced a new task: to get rid of the body so that it would never be found. They decided to choose a radical method. In their opinion, the only way to hide the remains was to cover them with concrete. They chose the bathroom as the location, where they set up a makeshift sarcophagus. Using cement, they completely covered the girl's body to create a heavy monolithic structure. After the concrete had set, they planned to remove the block, take it to a remote swampy area and drown it so that no one would be able to discover the remains. They hoped that the water and silt would make the concrete invisible so the investigation would be a dead end. Weaver realized that further resistance was pointless. After fully confessing to the crime, he agreed to cooperate with the investigation and indicated the exact place where he tried to destroy the evidence. On June 24, 2009, an investigative team consisting of operatives, cinematologists, and criminalists went to the forest area he named. They combed the area thoroughly and quickly found traces of burning, charred fragments, and tissue remnants. The evidence they found corroborated his testimony about his first attempt to dispose of the body with fire, which led to the explosion and the burns he received. The most important part of the confession, however, was the reference to the swamp where the body eventually ended up. Although the original plan was to hide the remains in the bathroom by pouring concrete over them, he and Angelique managed to remove the massive block from the house. They had succeeded in hiding it in a marshy area, hoping that way it would never be found. Now forensic investigators faced the daunting task of removing the concrete block from the marsh and performing an autopsy to officially confirm the location of the remains. It was a key moment in the investigation that could finally set the stage for the disappearance of Jada Justice. After opening the concrete block, investigators discovered the remains of a child. While the investigation continued to establish all the circumstances of the crime, another disturbing fact suddenly surfaced. During the investigation of Tim Kachik's connections, it became clear that Melissa Swiontek, Jada's mother, regularly purchased illegal substances from him. This information called into question her ability to be a responsible parent. If she was in contact with a man who had a criminal history and was associated with the distribution of illegal substances, then she was knowingly putting her children at risk. In addition, the investigators did not rule out that Melissa may have known more than she was telling because she entrusted her youngest daughter to people she did little or no vetting. This led to a serious discussion of terminating her parental rights. The court had to decide whether she should retain custody of her remaining children, given her neglect of their safety. After Kachik's confession and the discovery of new facts, the case took on a new ferocity. It was no longer just kidnapping, but premeditated murder, an attempt to cover up the crime and the abuse of illegal substances by adults who were supposed to be caring for the child. The investigation had to prove who exactly caused the girl's fatal injuries, how it happened, and to what extent each of the participants was guilty. One thing remained clear: the truth had finally come out, but the price was too high. The trial of Jada Justice caused a wide public outcry. The story of a 2-year-old girl who died at the hands of the people she was entrusted to shook the local community. Journalists closely followed the proceedings, and the public demanded fair punishment for those responsible. The trial was complex and emotionally intense. Prosecutors presented evidence of child abuse, cover-up, and manipulation by the defendants. The jury realized from the first days of the hearing that this case would leave no one indifferent. Angelica Armstrong tried to deflect responsibility from the beginning. She and her lawyer built the defense on the version that she did not know about the violence against the girl and did not participate in the murder. According to them, all the blame lay on Tim Kachik, who was allegedly the only person involved in the tragedy. The defense argued that on the day of the tragedy, Angelica was in a depressed emotional state and did not realize the magnitude of what was happening. According to her attorney, she helped Kachik dispose of the body out of fear and pressure, not of her own free will. But that theory quickly collapsed when prosecutors presented a key piece of evidence: an audio recording of their conversation made as part of Tkachuk's plea deal. Earlier, realizing the inevitability of punishment, Tkachuk had agreed to cooperate with the police, expecting a lighter sentence. During the investigation, a hidden microphone was attached to him, which was used to record his conversation with Angelika in the pre-trial detention cell. On the recording, Angelika was heard admitting that she had beaten the girl. She not only confirmed that she had beaten Jada, but also described in detail how it had happened. At one point, she even expressed regret that it resulted in death, but sounded annoyed rather than remorseful. This recording completely shattered Angelika's line of defense. The prosecution now had irrefutable proof of her guilt. During the investigation, a disturbing fact came to light. Melissa Swiatek, Jada's mother, regularly purchased illegal substances from Tim Tkachuk, a man with a criminal record implicated in her daughter's murder. This called into question her ability to be a responsible parent. The court examined the circumstances of the case in detail and concluded that Melissa had failed to exercise due care for her children. She entrusted Jada to people she barely knew without checking the conditions in which her child would be kept. Moreover, her regular contact with a trafficker of illegal substances indicated an irresponsible lifestyle. Throughout the investigation, by contrast, Clarence Justice, Jada's father, proved to be a caring and responsible parent. He assisted the investigation, participated in the search for his daughter, fought for the truth, and did everything he could to ensure that the perpetrators were punished. Taking all these factors into account, the court ordered Melissa's parental rights to be terminated. Custody of the two remaining children was awarded to Clarence Justice. He is now their sole legal guardian, and Melissa Swiatek is prohibited from having any contact with the children in order to safeguard their future. After much deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. It was harsh but fair. On July 19, 2013, the Indiana Circuit Court found Angelika Armstrong guilty of first-degree murder, cruelty to a child, concealing a body, and obstructing an investigation. She was sentenced to 65 years in prison without parole. On July 19, 2013, Timothy Tkachuk was found guilty of accessory to murder, destruction of evidence, unlawful possession of a controlled substance, and contributing to the cover-up of a crime. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison.